The last train vanished into the darkness, leaving Evelyn Carter alone on a windswept platform with nothing but a crumpled letter and shattered dreams. Her mail-order groom never came. As midnight crept toward dawn, she faced a terrible truth. She'd traveled across 2 states to marry a stranger who had abandoned her before they'd even met. But when sunrise painted the prairie gold, a lone cowboy emerged from the mist, and everything she thought she knew about destiny was about to change. If you're watching, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels across the world. Stay until the end, because what happens between a forgotten bride and an unexpected cowboy will restore your faith in second chances. The November wind cut across the Wyoming prairie like a blade fresh from the forge, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and the distant promise of snow. Evelyn Carter stood on the weather-beaten platform of Stillwater Station, her fingers clutching a letter that had long since grown damp from her nervous grip. The paper, once crisp and promising, now felt as fragile as her hope, words bleeding at the edges where her tears had fallen hours ago. "Last call for eastbound passengers." The conductor's voice echoed through the small station, a final warning before the locomotive pulled away with a hiss of steam and a mournful whistle that seemed to carry away the last vestiges of the life she'd known. Evelyn didn't move. She couldn't. Her feet remained planted on the rough wooden planks as if they'd taken root there, as if moving would somehow make the situation more real, more permanent, more devastating. The train disappeared into the gathering darkness, its red taillight growing smaller and smaller until it became just another star in the vast Montana sky. And still, Samuel Reed did not come. She'd memorized his letter by now, every curve of his penmanship, every promise he'd made. "Dear Miss Carter, I am a man of modest means but great ambition, seeking a woman of virtue and practical nature to build a life here in the territories. I own 50 acres of good grazing land, a sturdy cabin, and 6 head of cattle. What I lack is a partner to share in the prosperity I am building. If you are willing to take a chance on an honest man who will treat you with respect and provide for your every need, come to Stillwater Station on November 14th. I will be waiting with a ring and a promise. Yours in anticipation, Samuel Reed." November 14th had come and gone. The platform was empty. Samuel Reed was nowhere to be found. "Miss?" The station master's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. He was an older gentleman with kind eyes set deep in a weathered face, the sort of man who'd probably seen every kind of human drama play out on this lonely platform. "Miss, I'm closing up now. You can't stay here all night." Evelyn turned to face him, attempting a smile that felt like a physical effort, as if her face had forgotten how to arrange itself into anything resembling composure. "Of course. I'm sorry to have troubled you." "No trouble, miss." He paused, his expression softening with sympathy that somehow made everything worse. "But if you're waiting for someone, I should tell you, nobody else is coming through tonight. That was the last train until Tuesday." "I understand." Her voice came out steadier than she felt, a small victory in the ruins of her dignity. "Thank you for your patience." The station master lingered in the doorway of his small office, clearly uncomfortable leaving a woman alone in the dark. "You got somewhere to go? Family nearby? The boarding house in town might—" "I'll be fine," Evelyn interrupted gently. She couldn't bear his pity, couldn't stand to explain her situation to this stranger, to admit out loud that she'd been foolish enough to trust a letter from a man she'd never met, desperate enough to leave everything she'd known in Pennsylvania for the promise of something better in the untamed West. The station master nodded slowly, unconvinced but unwilling to press further. "Well, if you need anything, the telegraph office opens at 6. You can send word to wherever you came from. Arrange passage back." He paused. "Might be for the best, miss. This territory's got a way of breaking people who aren't ready for it." He tipped his hat and retreated into his office, and moments later, the lights inside flickered out one by one. Evelyn heard the distinct sound of a lock turning, the scrape of wood on wood as he secured the shutters. Then his footsteps faded into the distance, heading toward the cluster of buildings that made up the town proper. A 10-minute walk she could see in the moonlight, a collection of false-fronted stores and houses that seemed to huddle together against the vastness of the landscape. And then she was truly alone. Evelyn sank down onto her trunk, the battered leather case that contained everything she owned in the world. 2 dresses besides the one she wore. A worn Bible that had belonged to her mother. A cameo brooch, the only piece of jewelry she possessed. 3 books, poetry, because even in her most practical moments, she'd never been able to completely abandon beauty. A tin of tea. Undergarments she'd sewn herself by candlelight in the boarding house room she'd shared with 3 other working girls in Philadelphia. It wasn't much to show for 24 years of life, but it had seemed like enough when she'd boarded that train 3 days ago. Enough to start over. Enough to build something new with a man who'd promised her respect and security, if not love. The cold was settling in now, that particular bone-deep chill that comes to high desert country when the sun goes down. Evelyn pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders, knowing it wouldn't be enough but unable to do anything about it. Her better coat, the wool one she'd spent 2 months' wages on, had been stolen at a station in Kansas while she'd gone to fetch water. Just one more piece of bad luck in a string of disasters that had characterized this journey. Above her, the stars were emerging, thousands of them scattered across the sky with a brilliance she'd never seen back east. There was something almost violent about the beauty of it, the sheer indifference of those distant lights to her suffering. They'd been shining like this for millennia, would continue shining long after she was dust. What was one woman's disappointment measured against such vastness? "Stop it," she whispered to herself, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Self-pity won't change anything. She'd learned that lesson early, growing up in an orphanage where crying only marked you as weak, where showing pain was an invitation for more of it. She'd survived by being practical, by keeping her head down and her expectations low. But somewhere along the way, Samuel Reed's letter had cracked through those careful defenses. His words had painted pictures of a different life, simple but stable, isolated but safe. A place where she might finally stop running, stop surviving, and start actually living. What a fool she'd been. Hours crawled by. Evelyn watched the moon arc across the sky, marking time by its slow progress. She should move, should walk into town and find that boarding house the station master had mentioned. But something kept her rooted to that platform, some stubborn ember of hope that refused to die completely. Maybe Samuel had been delayed. Maybe his horse had thrown a shoe, or he'd gotten lost in the dark, or there was some perfectly reasonable explanation for why he hadn't met her as promised. Even as she thought it, she knew she was lying to herself. Men didn't get lost in their own territory. They didn't forget about the arrival of a woman they'd sent for. If Samuel Reed wasn't here, it was because he'd chosen not to be. The question was why. Had he changed his mind? Had he found someone else? Had he taken one look at her stepping off that train earlier, perhaps he'd been there, watching from a distance, and decided she wasn't what he'd expected? She knew she wasn't conventionally pretty, not in the way the fashion papers showed, too thin from years of inadequate meals, too tall for most men's taste, hands rough from work, face perhaps too serious, too guarded. Or maybe it had nothing to do with her at all. Maybe Samuel Reed had never intended to follow through. Maybe this was some cruel joke, or maybe he'd died in the interim between sending his letter and today. Maybe a dozen things that had nothing to do with her worth as a human being. But knowing that intellectually didn't stop the shame from burning in her chest, didn't prevent the small voice in her head from whispering that this was somehow her fault, that she'd been marked as unwanted from birth and would carry that mark until death. No. She said it out loud this time, firm and clear. I will not do this to myself. Whatever Samuel Reed's reasons, they were his own. She had done nothing wrong except trust in the possibility of something better. That wasn't a character flaw. It was perhaps the most human thing about her, the thing that had kept her going through all the dark years. She would not let this break her. The decision steadied her somewhat. She would wait until dawn. She'd already come this far, might as well see it through. Then she would walk into Stillwater, find work if possible, earn enough for passage back east. It would take time, perhaps weeks or even months, but she'd done it before. She could do it again. She was just beginning to doze, exhausted from 3 days of travel and the emotional toll of the night, when the sound reached her. At first she thought she was dreaming. The rhythmic thunder of hoofbeats seemed too perfectly timed with her racing heartbeat to be real. But then she opened her eyes and saw it. A single rider emerging from the pre-dawn mist that had begun to settle over the prairie like a living thing. The horse was moving fast, too fast for the uncertain light. Evelyn stood, her heart suddenly hammering with a confusing mixture of hope and fear. Could it be Samuel? Had he finally come? But as the rider drew closer, she could see this wasn't the approach of a man coming to meet his bride. This was someone riding with purpose, with urgency, as if the devil himself was on their heels. The horse, a beautiful paint with markings that caught the moonlight, slowed as it approached the platform. The rider sat tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered beneath a long duster coat that flapped behind him like wings. In the uncertain light, she couldn't make out his features, could only see that he was large, imposing, and currently staring at her with what seemed like confusion. "Ma'am?" His voice was deep, rough with either fatigue or surprise. "What in God's name are you doing out here alone?" It wasn't Samuel. This man's voice was different, harder, more weathered. Relief and disappointment warred in her chest. "I'm waiting for someone," she said, hating how small her voice sounded, how defensive. The rider swung down from his horse with fluid grace, and now she could see him better. He was tall, powerfully built, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days' worth of beard shadowing his jaw. His eyes, she couldn't tell their color in the dimness, were fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to step back. "You've been waiting out here all night?" It wasn't really a question. He could probably see the truth written all over her, the rumpled dress, the trunk she was sitting on, the exhaustion in every line of her body. "That's my concern, not yours." She lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated despite the fact that he was a stranger and she was utterly alone with him in the dark. Something shifted in his expression, surprise maybe, or respect. "Fair enough. But unless your someone is a ghost, you're waiting in vain. Nobody's coming down that road until sunup at earliest, and even then—" He trailed off, seeming to think better of whatever he'd been about to say. "Then I'll wait until sunup." She met his eyes steadily, even as her heart continued its nervous dance. Everything she'd been taught about propriety, about the dangers of speaking to strange men, was screaming at her to be cautious. But she'd already crossed so many lines by coming here. What was one more? The man studied her for a long moment, and she had the unsettling sensation of being evaluated, of having her whole story read in a single glance. Finally, he spoke again. "You wouldn't be waiting for Samuel Reed, would you?" The bottom dropped out of her stomach. "You know him?" "I know of him." The stranger's jaw tightened, and even in the poor light she could see anger flash across his features. "If you're here because of him, then I'm sorry to tell you this, but you're going to be waiting a long time. Samuel Reed skipped town 5 days ago with half the savings of the folks who'd trusted him with their investments." The words hit her like physical blows. Skip town, investments, 5 days ago. "No." She shook her head, the motion almost violent. "No, he wrote to me. He had land, cattle, a cabin. He had stories," the stranger interrupted gently. "Reed was a confidence man, ma'am. Came through about 3 months back with a smooth tongue and promises of profitable ventures. Got a bunch of folks, including some who couldn't afford to lose it, to invest in his supposed cattle operation. Then last week, he cleaned out the bank account he'd set up and disappeared. Marshall's been trying to track him, but he's long gone by now." Evelyn felt the platform sway beneath her feet. Or maybe that was her, swaying, the world tilting on its axis as everything clicked into horrible place. The letter. The promises. The way Samuel had asked her to bring her savings, just $50, he'd said, to help with wedding expenses and initial supplies. $50 she'd scraped together over 2 years of working 14-hour days in a laundry, money she'd sewn into the lining of her trunk for safekeeping. She'd been Mark's, not a bride. Not even a woman to Samuel Reed, just another opportunity to steal. "Ma'am?" The stranger's voice seemed to come from far away. "You should sit down. You've gone pale." "I'm fine." The words came automatically, a reflexive lie she'd been telling her whole life. "I'm perfectly fine." "With respect, ma'am, you look like you're about to fall over." And maybe she was, because suddenly the stranger's hand was on her elbow, steadying her, guiding her back down to sit on her trunk. The touch was impersonal, careful, but it was the first gentle physical contact she'd had in weeks, and something about it broke through the careful walls she'd built around herself. "He asked me to bring money." she whispered, staring at her hands. $50. For wedding expenses. I have it in my trunk. The stranger exhaled slowly, and when she looked up, his expression was a mixture of anger and pity that made her want to scream. Then you're luckier than most. At least you still have it. The folks he conned here lost everything. Lucky. She laughed, but it came out wrong, too high and sharp. Yes, I'm very lucky. Traveled 3 days across the country to marry a man who never existed, spent the last of my money on train fare, and now I'm stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no way home and no prospects. Extremely fortunate. I didn't mean... I know what you meant. She stood abruptly, needing to move, needing to do something other than sit and absorb blow after blow. Thank you for the information. I appreciate your honesty. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to figure out what to do next. She started to walk toward the edge of the platform, having no real destination in mind, just desperate to be away from this stranger's pity, from her own crushing humiliation. But his voice stopped her. Wait. She didn't turn around. Why? Because it's going to be dawn soon, and I can't in good conscience leave a woman alone out here when there's a perfectly good cabin about 2 miles up the canyon with hot coffee and a warm fire. Now she did turn, staring at him in disbelief. You're inviting me to your cabin? A strange man inviting a strange woman to an isolated location? Do I look that desperate? No, he said quietly. You look cold, exhausted, and betrayed. And I'm not inviting you as a strange man. I'm offering help as someone who knows what it's like to have your expectations crushed and your trust betrayed. No obligations, no expectations. Just a warm place to rest and figure out your next move. I don't even know your name. Luke Bennett. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture so old-fashioned it was almost charming. I run a small ranch about 10 miles north of here. I was in town dealing with some legal matters related to Reed's theft. I was one of the people he stole from, and I'm heading home now. You can come with me, get warm, maybe get some sleep. In the morning, I'll bring you back to town, and you can decide what to do from there. Evelyn wanted to refuse. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse. She knew nothing about this man except his name and his connection to her supposed groom's crimes. He could be as dangerous as Samuel Reed had proven to be dishonest. He could be worse. But as she stood there in the freezing pre-dawn air, watching the eastern horizon begin to lighten from black to navy to the faintest hint of gray, she had to acknowledge several uncomfortable truths. She was exhausted beyond rational thought. She had nowhere else to go until the town woke up. She had no money for a boarding house, even if one would take her at this hour. And despite everything, despite all her reasons for caution, something in Luke Bennett's voice rang true in a way that Samuel Reed's letter never had. Maybe it was the anger she'd seen flash across his face when he'd spoken about Reed's theft. Maybe it was the careful way he'd touched her elbow, steadying her without presuming. Maybe it was simply that she'd already gambled everything on a stranger's word once tonight, and what was one more risk in a life that had already fallen apart? All right, she heard herself say, but I'm keeping my knife handy, and I'm a very light sleeper. Something that might have been respect flickered in his eyes. I wouldn't expect anything less, ma'am. I'll get your trunk. He moved to lift it, and Evelyn quickly interjected. It's heavy. I've lifted heavier. He hoisted it onto his shoulder with an ease that suggested this was true, then walked to his horse and began securing it behind the saddle. The paint stood quietly, well-trained, barely flicking an ear at the added weight. Evelyn watched him work, noting the economical efficiency of his movements, the care he took to make sure her trunk was properly secured. Everything about him suggested competence, self-sufficiency, the kind of practical capability that came from years of hard work rather than empty boasting. He was nothing like the Samuel Reed she'd imagined. When he finished, he turned back to her. You can ride behind me, or I can walk and lead the horse while you ride. Your choice. The offer surprised her. Most men wouldn't have given her a choice at all, would have simply expected her to comply with whatever arrangement they'd decided upon. I can ride behind you. I grew up around horses. It was something of an exaggeration. She'd been around the delivery horses at the orphanage and had occasionally been allowed to help feed them, but she understood the basic mechanics of mounting and staying seated. Luke led the horse to the platform's edge, where the height difference would make mounting easier. He swung up first, then extended his hand down to her. "Step up on that crate there, then take my hand." Evelyn hesitated for just a moment, staring at his outstretched hand. This was the point of no return. Once she got on that horse, she would be completely at this stranger's mercy, dependent on his goodwill and honesty in a way that terrified her. But dawn was breaking now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and with the light came a strange sense of clarity. She could spend the rest of her life being afraid, being cautious, protecting herself from potential hurt. Or she could take the risk, make the leap, trust in her own judgment and the kindness of strangers. Samuel Reed might have been a liar, but that didn't mean every man was. She took Luke Bennett's hand. His grip was strong, calloused from work, and he pulled her up behind him with seemingly little effort. "Put your arms around my waist and hold on. The trail's a bit rough in places." Evelyn did as instructed, feeling awkward and hyper-aware of the impropriety of the situation. She was pressed against a strange man's back, her arms wrapped around his torso, close enough to feel the warmth of his body through the layers of clothing, to smell the scent of horse and leather and something else, pine maybe, or juniper. "Ready?" he asked over his shoulder. "As I'll ever be." He clicked his tongue, and the horse moved forward with a smooth gait that suggested good training and better breeding. They left the platform behind, heading north on a trail that was barely visible in the growing light. As they rode, Evelyn found herself relaxing slightly despite her circumstances. There was something soothing about the rhythm of the horse's movement, the steady strength of the man she was holding on to, the way the world was slowly emerging from darkness. She could see now that they were riding through a landscape of rolling hills dotted with sage and juniper, with mountains rising in the distance like sleeping giants. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. Beautiful and utterly foreign to someone who'd grown up in the crowded streets of Philadelphia, where nature was something that happened in city parks under careful supervision. "How long have you lived out here?" she asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. 5 years. Came out after the war, looking for something different from what I'd left behind." The war. She remembered it, of course. She'd been young when it ended, but the orphanage had been full of children whose fathers hadn't come home, whose mothers couldn't manage alone. "You fought?" "Union cavalry, though I don't talk about it much. Not many out here who care which side you were on, as long as you pull your weight now." There was a weight to his words, a history she didn't pry into. Everyone had their ghosts, their reasons for heading west to start over. His were his own business. They rode in silence for a while longer, climbing into a canyon where the walls rose on either side. Rock faces turned pink and gold by the rising sun. A creek ran along the canyon floor, and she could hear the musical sound of water over stone, the first genuinely pleasant sound she'd heard since arriving in this territory. "Almost there," Luke said. "Just around this next bend." The cabin appeared as if it had grown naturally from the landscape. It was small but well built, constructed of logs that had weathered to a silver gray, with a stone chimney from which a thin trail of smoke was rising. There was a barn beyond it, a corral with several horses, and what looked like a chicken coop. Everything spoke of a man who'd put down roots, who intended to stay. Luke dismounted first, then helped her down. Her legs were stiff from the ride, and she stumbled slightly. His hand shot out to steady her, and once again she was struck by the carefulness of his touch. "Come inside," he said, leading her toward the door. "I'll get the fire built up and put some coffee on, then see to the horses." The interior of the cabin was Spartan, but clean. A single room with a large fireplace dominating one wall, a bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs, shelves lined with books and supplies. The floor was wood, not dirt, and there were curtains on the windows, rough fabric but functional. It was the home of a man who lived alone but hadn't given up on civilization entirely. Luke moved to the fireplace, stirring the embers and adding fresh wood with practiced ease. Within minutes, flames were licking upward, throwing warmth and dancing light across the room. He filled a battered coffee pot from a bucket of water and set it on an iron hook that swung over the flames. "Make yourself comfortable," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "I need to tend to the horse and get your trunk inside. I'll be back in a few minutes." Then he was gone, leaving her alone in his home with his possessions and his trust. Evelyn sank into the chair, suddenly so exhausted she could barely keep her eyes open. The warmth from the fire was seeping into her bones, loosening muscles that had been clenched tight with cold and tension for hours. She should stay alert, should remain vigilant, should keep her guard up. But she was so tired of being strong, of being cautious, of protecting herself from a world that seemed determined to hurt her. Her eyes drifted closed just for a moment, just while Luke was outside. When she opened them again, sunlight was streaming through the windows, and there was a blanket draped over her shoulders that hadn't been there before. The coffee pot was sitting on the hearth, and Luke Bennett was seated at the table, reading a book and drinking from a chipped mug. He looked up when she stirred, and something like relief crossed his features. "Thought you might sleep through till evening. You were out cold." Evelyn sat up straight, embarrassment flooding through her. She'd fallen asleep in a stranger's home, let her guard down completely, violated every rule of self-preservation she'd ever learned. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to—" "No need to apologize. You needed rest, and you're safe here. I promise you that." He stood and poured coffee into a second mug, bringing it over to her. "It's strong. Fair warning." She accepted it gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm ceramic and breathing in the bitter, wonderful scent. The first sip burned her tongue, but she didn't care. It was perfect. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for all of this. You didn't have to help me." Luke returned to his seat, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe not, but I remember what it's like to be lost and alone, to have your world fall apart and not know where to turn. Someone helped me once, when I needed it. Figured I'd pay it forward." "Who helped you?" He hesitated, and she thought he might not answer. Then, "Her name was Anna. She was supposed to be my wife. We'd been engaged before the war, promised to wait for each other. And she did wait. 4 years of not knowing if I was alive or dead. 4 years of keeping faith. When I came back, we made plans to head west together, start fresh where the war hadn't touched." He paused, staring into his coffee. "She got sick on the trail. Fever took her before we even made it to Wyoming. I didn't handle it well. I'm sorry." The words felt inadequate, but what else could she say? "It was a long time ago, but I wouldn't have survived that first year if not for some folks who took me in when I was half crazy with grief, who gave me work and purpose when I had neither. So when I see someone in trouble—" He trailed off with a shrug. They sat in silence for a moment, two wounded souls finding unexpected comfort in shared loss. Then Luke spoke again. "What about you? What made you answer Samuel Reed's letter?" Evelyn considered lying, considered crafting a more palatable version of her story, but something about the honesty of his grief deserved honesty in return. "I was desperate," she said simply. "I've been working in a laundry in Philadelphia for 6 years, 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. The pay is barely enough to survive on, and there's no future in it. I'm 24 years old and I could see my whole life stretching ahead of me, working until my hands are ruined and my back is broken, dying alone in some charity hospital when I'm too old to work anymore." She took another sip of coffee. When Samuel's letter arrived, someone had put it up on a board at the general store, advertising for potential brides. It seemed like a sign. A chance at something different, something better, or at least something that wouldn't kill me quite so slowly. "That's not desperate," Luke said quietly. "That's brave. Stupid, maybe, to trust a stranger's word, but brave nonetheless." "I don't feel very brave right now. I feel like a fool." "The two aren't mutually exclusive." He smiled slightly. "Some of the bravest people I've known have also been the biggest fools." Despite everything, Evelyn felt her lips curve upward. Was that meant to be comforting? Was it? "A little, actually." They lapsed into silence again, but it was comfortable now, the awkwardness of earlier fading into something that felt almost like companionship. Outside, she could hear birds beginning their morning songs, the distant lowing of cattle, the wind moving through the canyon. It was peaceful, dangerously peaceful, the kind of peace that made her want to stay, to linger in this moment of unexpected sanctuary. But she couldn't. She had no place here, no right to impose on Luke Bennett's hospitality any longer than absolutely necessary. "I should get back to town," she said, setting down her mug. "Figure out what to do next. Maybe find work, save up for passage back east." "That's one option," Luke agreed. Or? He seemed to be weighing his words carefully, choosing them with the same precision he'd shown in everything else. Or you could stay here for a while. Just temporarily, he added quickly, as if worried she'd misunderstand. Until you figure things out. I could use help around the place, someone to handle the cooking and cleaning, maybe tend the garden come spring. I'd pay you fair wages and you'd have a roof over your head and food to eat. It'd give you time to save up properly, decide what you really want to do. Evelyn stared at him, trying to read his intentions, searching for the hidden catch she was certain must exist. Men didn't make offers like this without expecting something in return. But his expression was open, honest, and she remembered what he'd said about someone helping him when he needed it most. Maybe he really was just paying it forward. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You don't know me. For all you know, I could be a terrible cook or a thief or worse." "Could be," he acknowledged. "But I'm a pretty good judge of character, and I don't think you're any of those things. Besides, worst case, I'm out a few weeks of wages and you move on. Best case, we both benefit from the arrangement. Seems like a reasonable risk to me." It did seem reasonable, almost too reasonable, which made her immediately suspicious. But as she sat there in the warm cabin, drinking coffee that tasted like hope, looking at a man who'd shown her more genuine kindness in a few hours than most people had in her entire life, she found herself wanting to believe, wanting to take the risk, wanting to say yes to this unexpected possibility. "I have one condition," she said finally. "Name it." "I keep my own space. I'll sleep in the barn or... There's a root cellar out back that the previous owner half converted into a storage room. It's got a door that locks from the inside and there's enough space for a bed. It'd need some cleaning out, but it could work." "Then yes," Evelyn heard herself say. "I'll stay, temporarily." Luke nodded, something like relief flickering across his features. "Fair enough. We'll give it a month, see how it goes. If either of us wants out before then, no hard feelings." He extended his hand across the table, and after a moment's hesitation, Evelyn took it. His grip was firm, honest, the handshake of someone sealing a genuine bargain rather than setting a trap. "Thank you," she said. "I won't let you down." "I know," he replied, and the simple confidence in his voice did something strange to her chest, made her feel seen and trusted in a way she couldn't quite name. They finished their coffee as the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the canyon walls in ever-changing shades of gold and amber. And as Evelyn sat there, in the home of a stranger who'd ridden through the dawn to save her from a night of despair, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt hope. The root cellar turned out to be more than Evelyn had dared hope for. It was built into the hillside behind the cabin, with thick stone walls that would keep it cool in summer and insulated in winter. The previous owner had indeed started converting it. There was a small window cut into one wall, a wooden floor instead of packed dirt, and crude shelving along two sides. But years of neglect had left it dusty and cluttered with abandoned tools, empty crates, and what looked like the remnants of someone's failed attempts at furniture making. "I know it doesn't look like much," Luke said, standing in the doorway with his hands shoved in his pockets, looking almost apologetic. "But give me a few hours and I can make it livable. There's a bed frame in the barn I can bring over, and I've got extra blankets stored away." Evelyn stepped inside, running her hand along the rough stone wall. It was cold to the touch, solid, real, a space that could be hers, however temporarily. "It's perfect. Or it will be, once we clean it out." "We?" Luke raised an eyebrow. "You just traveled for 3 days straight and didn't sleep last night. You should rest." "I'm not an invalid, Mr. Bennett. I can help clean my own room." Something flickered in his expression, amusement maybe, or respect. "Luke, if we're going to be working together, you should call me Luke." "Evelyn," she offered in return, "though most people call me Evie." "Evelyn it is, then." He said it carefully, as if testing the weight of her name. "Evie sounds like someone young and carefree. You strike me as someone who's had to grow up too fast." The observation was so accurate it stole her breath for a moment. "Is that what you see when you look at me?" "I see someone who's strong, someone who's survived things that would have broken other people, someone who's still standing when they have every reason to fall down." He cleared his throat, suddenly looking uncomfortable. "Anyway, let me get some tools and we'll get started." They worked through the afternoon, falling into an easy rhythm that surprised them both. Luke hauled out the larger items and swept away years of accumulated dust and cobwebs, while Evelyn organized the smaller objects, determining what was worth keeping and what needed to be discarded. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them was comfortable, punctuated by the scrape of broom on wood and the occasional question about where something should go. As the sun began its descent toward the canyon rim, the small room had been transformed. The bed frame Luke had promised turned out to be solid oak, handmade by someone with genuine skill. He'd fit it with a rope lattice for support and topped it with a thick mattress that smelled faintly of cedar from the chest where it had been stored. "This is too nice," Evelyn protested as he added a quilt that looked hand-stitched, the kind of thing that took months to make. "You don't need to—" "Anna made it," Luke said quietly, "before we left for the territories. She was always making things, always preparing for the home we'd have together. After she died, I couldn't bear to look at most of it, so I packed it away." He smoothed his hand over the quilt's surface, his expression distant. She'd want it to be used. She'd want someone to get joy from her work. Evelyn didn't know what to say to that, how to respond to such unexpected trust, so she simply placed her hand briefly over his, a moment of shared understanding, before stepping back. "I'll take good care of it." "I know you will." He left her to settle in, and Evelyn stood alone in her new space, trying to process everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. She'd gone from hopeful bride to abandoned woman to unexpected employee, had placed her trust in a complete stranger and found herself in possession of a room that felt more like home than anywhere she'd lived in years. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was real. She unpacked her trunk carefully, hanging her 2 spare dresses on pegs Luke had installed in the wall, arranging her books on one of the shelves, placing her mother's Bible and the cameo brooch on the small table beside the bed. The $50, her safety net, her last resort, she kept sewn into the trunk's lining, just in case. By the time she emerged from the root cellar, dusk had settled over the canyon and the smell of cooking meat was drifting from the cabin. Luke was at the stove, poking dubiously at something in a cast-iron skillet. "I should warn you," he said without turning around. "My cooking is barely edible on good days. If you were hoping for a decent meal tonight, you're going to be disappointed." Evelyn moved to peer over his shoulder at what appeared to be an attempt at fried salt pork and potatoes. The pork was burned on one side and raw on the other. The potatoes were sticking to the pan in blackened chunks, and the whole thing looked like it was staging a rebellion against being considered food. "How long have you been living alone?" she asked. 5 years? And you still haven't learned to cook?" "I learned to survive. Cooking's different." She couldn't help but laugh, the first genuine laugh she'd had in longer than she could remember. "Move over. Let me see what I can salvage." Luke stepped aside with visible relief, and Evelyn took command of the stove with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to cook in an institutional kitchen where failure meant going hungry. The pork was a lost cause, but she scraped the potatoes into a bowl, salvaged what she could, and started fresh. Within 20 minutes, she'd produced something that, while humble, was at least recognizably food. They ate at the small table, the meal punctuated by the crackle of the fire and the distant call of a nightbird. Luke ate with the focused intensity of someone who'd been living on his own bad cooking for too long, and Evelyn found herself strangely pleased by his obvious enjoyment. "This is the best meal I've had in months," he said when his plate was clean. "Maybe years. It's just potatoes and eggs. It's edible potatoes and eggs, which is more than I usually manage." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with those steady eyes. "I think this arrangement is going to work out just fine." Evelyn felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "Don't speak too soon. You haven't tasted my bread yet." "You can make bread?" "I can make a lot of things, Mr. Luke. I might not have had much in the way of advantages, but the orphanage where I grew up made sure we learned practical skills. Cooking, cleaning, sewing, basic animal husbandry. Everything a good domestic servant might need." Something in her tone must have betrayed more than she intended, because Luke's expression shifted. "That where you grew up? An orphanage?" "From age 6, my mother died in childbirth with what would have been my younger sibling. My father lasted 3 years after that before drink took him too. No other family willing to take in a child, so the orphanage it was." "That's hard. I'm sorry." Evelyn shrugged, uncomfortable with sympathy. It could have been worse. Some places beat the children or starved them. Ours was strict but fair. We were fed, clothed, educated enough to read and write. When I turned 16, they found me placement in the laundry. I've been working there ever since. She paused. Or I was until 3 days ago when I quit to come here. You quit your job to marry a stranger? I did. She met his eyes steadily. I know how that sounds, desperate, foolish, reckless, but I was desperate. 6 more years of that work and my hands would have been ruined. The foreman was already making comments about how I'd better find a husband soon because laundry work was for younger girls with stronger backs. I was running out of time and options. So Samuel Reed's letter seemed like an answer to a prayer. More like the only door in a hallway of locked rooms. I didn't expect love or even affection. I just wanted security, safety, a chance to stop fighting quite so hard just to survive. She pushed her plate away. Shows what I know about assessing opportunities. Reed fooled a lot of people, Evelyn. Folks who'd lived here for years and thought they were good judges of character. You can't blame yourself for falling for a con man's lies. Can't I? I was so eager to believe, so desperate for something better, that I didn't ask the questions I should have asked. Didn't wonder why a man with land and cattle needed to send away for a bride. Didn't question why he asked for money. I saw what I wanted to see. Luke was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "We all do that sometimes. See what we want to see instead of what's really there." After Anna died, I spent a year drinking and brawling and generally destroying myself because I couldn't accept that she was gone, that all our plans were just smoke. Finally got into a fight with someone twice my size and got myself beaten so bad I couldn't stand. Woke up in a stranger's barn, being tended by a man who told me I had 2 choices. I could get back on the self-destruction train and finish what I'd started, or I could decide that Anna wouldn't have wanted me to die with her, that her dreams deserved to live even if she couldn't. What did you choose? Obviously, I chose to live. Wasn't easy. Some days it still isn't. But I built this place, built something real out of the ashes of what I'd lost. And I decided that maybe the point wasn't the happy ending I'd planned. Maybe the point was just to keep going, keep trying, keep building something worth having, even if it looked different than I'd imagined. Evelyn felt her throat tighten with emotion she couldn't quite name. That's a good way to look at it. Some days I believe it more than others. He stood, gathering the dishes. But having someone to cook for, having another person around who isn't me and my dark thoughts, that helps. So thank you for agreeing to stay. Thank you for offering. She rose to help with the dishes, but he waved her off. You cooked. I'll clean. That seems fair. She was too tired to argue, so she simply nodded and moved toward the door. I should turn in. Tomorrow I want to start earning my keep properly. Evelyn? His voice stopped her at the threshold. I'm glad you were on that platform last night. Glad I found you. So am I, she said softly. Good night, Luke. Good night. She crossed the dark yard to her little room, the stars overhead so bright and numerous they seemed almost artificial. Inside, she changed into her nightgown, slipped between the sheets of Anna's quilt, and let herself finally, fully, break down. The tears came hot and silent, tears for her shattered dreams and wounded pride, for the future she'd imagined and lost, for the exhaustion and fear and desperate hope that had brought her to this strange place. But underneath the grief was something else, something new and fragile but unmistakably real. Relief, maybe, or gratitude, or the first tentative stirrings of something that might, with time, become happiness. The days that followed fell into a pattern that felt both foreign and strangely right. Evelyn would wake before dawn to the sound of Luke moving around outside, tending to the animals and preparing for his day's work. By the time he came in for breakfast, she'd have coffee ready and food on the table. Simple fare, but hot and plentiful. They'd eat together in companionable silence. Then Luke would head out to work on whatever the ranch required, while Evelyn tackled the domestic chaos of a home that had been maintained by a man who clearly considered cleaning an optional activity. The cabin needed everything. The floors hadn't been properly scrubbed in years. The windows were so dirty she could barely see through them. Every dish, every piece of fabric, every surface was coated in a film of dust and neglect. But Evelyn didn't mind. In fact, she found the work satisfying in a way that laundry duty had never been. This was her space to organize, her domain to bring order to. Every clean surface felt like a small victory, every improvement a testament to her presence and purpose. Luke noticed, though he didn't comment much. He'd just pause in the doorway, taking in the transformed space, and nod with what looked like approval before heading back to his work. But one evening, about a week into her stay, he came in to find curtains hung on the windows, curtains she'd sewn from some fabric she'd found in a trunk, working by lamplight after her other tasks were done. He stood there staring at them for so long that Evelyn began to worry she'd overstepped. "I hope you don't mind. I found the fabric in storage and thought it was going to waste, so I—" "Anna bought that fabric," he said quietly, "in Laramie, on our way west. Said she was going to make curtains for our windows once we got settled." He touched the edge of one panel, his expression unreadable. "She'd be happy to see them finally being used. I can take them down if they bother you." "No." He dropped his hand, turning to face her. "No, leave them up. You're right, they were going to waste, and the cabin needs a woman's touch. Needed it for a long time." They looked at each other across the small space, and Evelyn felt something shift between them, some subtle realignment of their relationship. They weren't just employer and employee anymore. They were becoming something else. Not quite friends, but not strangers either. Two damaged people finding unexpected comfort in each other's presence. The moment passed, and Luke cleared his throat. "I need to ride into Stillwater tomorrow. Supply run and some business with the marshal about Reed's theft. You're welcome to come if you want to see the town properly." "Will people talk about me staying here?" "Probably. Small town, not much else to gossip about. But I figure that's their problem, not ours. We know the arrangement is legitimate. That's what matters." Evelyn considered. She would need to face Stillwater eventually, would need to establish herself as something other than the abandoned mail-order bride. Might as well get it over with. "All right, I'll come." The ride into town the next morning was comfortable, the paint horse carrying them both with steady patience. Evelyn sat behind Luke again, but this time the intimacy of it didn't feel quite so awkward. She was getting used to his presence, to the solid warmth of him, to the way he rode with unconscious grace. Stillwater was larger than she'd expected, with perhaps 24 buildings clustered along a main street that ran parallel to the railroad tracks. There was a general store, a bank, a doctor's office, a church, a hotel, several saloons, and various other businesses that served the ranching community scattered across the surrounding territory. Luke helped her down in front of the general store. "I need to go see the marshal first. Should take about an hour. Will you be all right on your own?" "I'm not a child, Luke. I can manage an hour in a general store." He grinned. She was seeing that expression more often now, and she liked it. "Fair point. I'll meet you back here." The store was dim and crowded with merchandise, smelling of leather and coffee and pickles. The proprietor, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and graying hair, looked up from her accounts when Evelyn entered. "Help you with something?" Her tone was neutral, but her gaze was assessing. "Just browsing, thank you." Evelyn moved through the aisles slowly, taking in the available goods and mentally cataloging what Luke's household might need. Soap, definitely. Some decent tea if they had it. Maybe fabric for a new shirt. His were all worn thin at the elbows. She was so absorbed in her inventory that she didn't notice the other women entering until one of them spoke. "That's her." The voice was pitched to Carrie, meant to be overheard. Evelyn turned to find 3 women clustered near the entrance, all of them staring at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. "Are you sure?" one of them whispered, not quietly enough. "Of course I'm sure. Martha said she saw Luke Bennett riding in with a woman, and there aren't exactly a lot of strangers in town. That must be the mail-order bride Reed abandoned." Evelyn felt her face flush hot, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd dealt with gossip before, with the judgment of people who thought they knew her story. She could handle this. "I heard she's living out at Luke's place now," the third woman said, her voice dripping with implication. "A single woman, alone with a bachelor. Scandalous." "Maybe she's trading one arrangement for another," the first woman suggested with a cruel little laugh. "Though I can't imagine what Luke Bennett sees in her. She's so plain." "Clara, that's unkind." This from the second woman, though her tone suggested she didn't actually disagree, just thought it shouldn't be said out loud. Evelyn set down the soap she'd been examining with deliberate care and turned to face her critics directly. If you have questions about my situation, perhaps you should ask me rather than speculating amongst yourselves like schoolgirls. The women looked taken aback, clearly not expecting direct confrontation. The one called Clara recovered first, lifting her chin defensively. We're simply concerned about propriety. This is a respectable community. Is it? Evelyn kept her voice level, pleasant even. Because I was under the impression that a respectable community would have warned an incoming stranger about a known con man operating in their midst. Perhaps I'm mistaken about what respectability means. Direct hit. All three women flushed, and the shopkeeper made a choking sound that might have been suppressed laughter. Now see here, Clara blustered. We had no way of knowing Reed was, and I have no obligation to defend my private arrangements to strangers, Evelyn interrupted smoothly. Mr. Bennett has been nothing but honorable. I'm working as his housekeeper in exchange for room, board, and fair wages. If your minds immediately leapt to something sordid, perhaps that says more about your imagination than my character. She turned back to her shopping, heart pounding but hand steady. Behind her, she heard the women whispering furiously, then the sound of the door opening and closing as they left. The shopkeeper appeared at her elbow, her expression approving. Well handled. Those three are the worst gossips in town. Nothing better to do than tear down anyone who doesn't fit their narrow view of propriety. She extended a hand. I'm Margaret Patterson. I own this establishment with my husband. Evelyn Carter. She shook the offered hand. I'm sorry if I caused a scene. Caused a scene? You gave them exactly what they deserved. Most people just let Clara and her cronies talk because it's easier than fighting back. But they respect strength, even if they don't like it. Margaret began gathering the items Evelyn had been looking at. You're really working for Luke Bennett? I am. Good. That man's been alone too long, living like a hermit in that canyon. Could use some civilizing influence. She paused. And for what it's worth, nobody who knows Luke thinks there's anything improper going on. He's one of the most decent men in this territory. It's just the biddies who don't know him, who like to speculate. Thank you, that's kind. Just honest. Margaret tallied up the purchases. Luke has an account here. Should I add this to it? Please. While Margaret wrapped her items, the door opened again and a man entered, tall, weathered, with a tin star pinned to his vest. He nodded to Margaret, then his eyes landed on Evelyn. You must be Miss Carter. Luke mentioned you'd be in town today. I'm Marshal Tom Crawford. He removed his hat. I wanted to apologize on behalf of Stillwater for what happened with Samuel Reed. If I'd caught wind of what he was planning, I'd have tried to warn you. That's not your fault, Marshal. Reed was a professional con artist. He fooled everyone. Still doesn't sit right, a young woman being taken advantage of like that. If there's anything I can do to help you get settled, you just let me know. Actually, Evelyn said, making a sudden decision, there is something. Do you know if Reed left behind any personal effects? Letters, documents, anything that might indicate he'd contacted other women? Crawford's expression turned grim. He did, actually. Whole stack of correspondence in his room at the boarding house. Why? Because if he wrote to me, he probably wrote to others. Women who might be on their way here right now, expecting to find a groom who doesn't exist. They deserve a warning. The marshal studied her for a long moment. That's mighty thoughtful of you, considering what you've been through. Nobody deserves what I went through. If I can prevent it happening to someone else, I will. I'll bring those letters by Luke's place tomorrow. You can go through them, see if we can get word out to anyone who might be in danger. He paused. You're tougher than you look, Miss Carter. I've had to be, Marshal. Luke found her outside the store, her parcels waiting on the bench. He took in her expression, still slightly flushed from her encounter, and frowned. Trouble? Nothing I couldn't handle? Just some women with more opinions than sense. His jaw tightened. Let me guess. Clara Morrison and her circle? You know them? Everyone knows them. Mean-spirited gossips who make everyone's business their own. What did they say? The usual things people say about unmarried women living under the same roof as unmarried men. I informed them that my living arrangements were none of their concern. Luke's expression shifted from anger to something that might have been pride. Good. Let them talk. Anyone worth knowing won't care. They loaded her purchases onto the horse, and Luke started to mount, then paused. There's one more stop I want to make, if you don't mind. Of course. He led her down the street to a small building with a sign reading Stillwater Telegraph Office. Inside, a clerk looked up from his desk. Afternoon, Luke. What can I do for you? I need to send a telegram. Luke pulled out a slip of paper where he'd already written his message. To my sister in Missouri. Tell her I'm doing well and not to worry. The clerk read the message, nodded, and began tapping it out on his key. Evelyn waited by the door, surprised. Luke had never mentioned family. When they were back outside, she said, You have a sister? 2, actually, and a brother. They stayed in Missouri when I came west. Sarah, the oldest, writes me sometimes, checking that I haven't died or gone completely feral out here alone. He helped her onto the horse. I figured I should let her know I've got someone cooking actual meals now. She'll be relieved. You're telling your family about me? Just that I hired a housekeeper. Nothing to get worked up about. But there was something in his tone, something careful and deliberate, that made Evelyn wonder if there was more to the message than he was saying. Was he warning them off from worrying, or was he telling them something more significant? The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. But as they crested the ridge and the canyon opened up before them, Luke spoke suddenly. I'm sorry about those women, about the gossip. It's not your fault. Still, you came here looking for a fresh start, and instead you're dealing with judgment and speculation. That's not fair. Life isn't fair, Luke. I learned that a long time ago. She paused. But for what it's worth, I don't regret staying. This is better than anything I left behind. He turned his head slightly, enough that she could see his profile, the serious set of his jaw. I'm glad, because I don't regret asking you to stay either. These past few days, having someone to talk to, having the cabin feel like a home again, it's been good, really good. Something in Evelyn's chest tightened, warm and frightening at the same time. This was dangerous territory, these feelings that were starting to develop. She couldn't afford to confuse gratitude with something deeper, couldn't risk mistaking comfort for affection. She'd made that mistake with Samuel Reed's letter, seeing promise where there was only deception. But as they rode down into the canyon, as the setting sun painted everything gold and the wind carried the scent of juniper and possibility, she let herself feel what she was feeling without examining it too closely. Just for now. Just for this moment. Maybe that was enough. That night, Evelyn lay awake in her small room, listening to the wind whisper through the canyon and thinking about everything that had changed in such a short time. The quilt Anna had made was soft against her skin, and she found herself wondering about the woman who'd stitched it, about the dreams she'd sewn into every careful seam. Had Anna imagined a life like this? Had she pictured herself in a canyon home, waiting for her soldier to return from the day's work, building something solid and lasting in this harsh, beautiful land? The questions led to others, more dangerous ones. Questions about what Evelyn herself was building here, about whether gratitude and comfort could become something more, about whether she even wanted them to. She'd come west looking for security, not romance. Her heart had been firmly locked away, protected by layers of practicality and self-preservation. But Luke Bennett was proving difficult to keep at a distance. Every small kindness, every moment of understanding, every shared silence was wearing away at her defenses. She was still wrestling with these thoughts when sleep finally claimed her, pulling her down into dreams of trains that never arrived and cowboys who rode through endless dawns. Marshal Crawford arrived mid-morning the next day, riding up to the cabin with saddlebags that bulged ominously. Luke was out mending fence line, so Evelyn met the marshal alone, wiping flour from her hands as she stepped out to greet him. Miss Carter. He dismounted, pulling the bags down with him. Brought those letters I mentioned. There's more than I expected. Reed was running this scheme on a bigger scale than we realized. Evelyn's stomach tightened as he hefted the bags onto the porch. How many? Couple dozen, at least. Some are responses to his advertisements, some are letters he'd already sent out. The man kept copies of everything, probably so he could keep his lies straight. Crawford shook his head in disgust. I've got to get back to town, but I figured you might want to go through these, see if there's anyone we need to warn. I'll do that. Thank you, Marshal. After he left, Evelyn stood staring at the saddlebags for a long moment before carrying them inside. She spread the contents across the table, dozens of letters, some still sealed, others clearly read and reread. The handwriting varied wildly, from careful copperplate to barely legible scrawls, but the desperation underlying them all was remarkably similar. She opened the first letter, postmarked from Illinois. Dear Mr. Reed, I received your advertisement with great interest. I am a widow of 32 years with 2 young children. My late husband's family has made it clear we are not welcome to remain on their property, and I find myself in dire circumstances. If your offer is genuine, I would be most grateful for the opportunity to discuss further arrangements. The second was from a woman in Ohio who'd been jilted by her fiancé and cast out by her family for the resulting scandal. The third from a school teacher who'd lost her position when the school board decided she was too old and unmarried to be a proper influence on young minds. On and on they went, each one a small tragedy, each woman grasping at Samuel Reed's lies because the alternative was worse. Evelyn's hands were shaking by the time she'd read through half of them. These were her sisters in desperation, women who'd been ground down by a world that offered them precious few options, women who deserved better than to be victimized by a man like Reed. She was composing a list of names and addresses when Luke returned, dusty and tired from his work. He took in the scene, the scattered letters, her pale face, the tension in her shoulders, and immediately moved to the stove to pour her a cup of coffee. That bad? He asked gently, setting the cup beside her. Worse, Luke, there are so many of them, and some of these are recent, women who might already be on their way here. He picked up one of the letters, scanning it quickly. His expression hardened. We need to contact them all, every single one. Make sure they know Reed's gone and why. That will take time, and money for telegrams. I don't care about the money. This needs to be done. He pulled out the chair across from her, sitting down heavily. How many can we reach by telegram versus mail? They worked through the afternoon, sorting letters into urgent and less urgent piles, composing careful messages that conveyed the truth without being cruel. Evelyn found herself grateful for Luke's presence, for the quiet anger in his voice that matched her own, for the way he understood without being told why this mattered so much. You're a good man, Luke Bennett, she said at one point, looking up from a particularly heartbreaking letter from a young woman with 3 children and nowhere to go. He met her eyes, and something passed between them. Recognition, respect, the beginning of something deeper. I'm just trying to do what's right, same as you. Most men wouldn't care about this, would say these women should have known better, should have been less desperate, less trusting. Then most men are fools. He leaned back in his chair. I watched Anna die because the town we were passing through had a doctor who wouldn't treat her unless I paid him in advance. I didn't have the money, and by the time I managed to scrape it together, it was too late. I learned then that the world's full of people who will exploit desperation instead of helping with it. I swore I'd never be one of them. Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. I'm sorry that happened to you, to both of you. Me too. Every day. He stood, gathering the urgent pile. I'll ride into town tomorrow, send all these telegrams. The rest we can mail from there. I'm coming with you. Evelyn, you don't have to. Yes, I do. These are my sisters in this, Luke. I need to be part of making it right. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, we'll go together. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Between managing the household and working through Reed's correspondence, Evelyn barely had time to think. Responses started coming back, some grateful, some angry, some devastated. A few women wrote back asking if there were other opportunities in Stillwater, other men looking for wives, other ways to escape the circumstances that had made Reed's lies so appealing. Those letters haunted Evelyn. She took to saving them, keeping them separate from the others, though she wasn't sure why. What could she do for these women? She was barely managing her own precarious situation, but the thought wouldn't leave her alone. It nagged at her during the day as she worked, whispered to her at night as she tried to sleep. There had to be something, some way to help that didn't involve matching desperate women with potentially dangerous strangers. She was kneading bread one afternoon, working through the problem in her mind, when Luke came in early from his work. He was carrying something wrapped in burlap, cradling it carefully. Got something for you, he said, setting the bundle on the table. Well, for the chickens, really, but I figured you'd want to see. Evelyn wiped her hands and opened the burlap to find a dozen chicks, fuzzy and peeping, tumbling over each other in their confusion. Oh, she breathed, scooping one up gently. Oh, Luke, they're perfect. Thought you might like having them, and fresh eggs would be good come spring. He watched her with the chicks, something soft in his expression. You've got a gentle hand with living things. I always wanted chickens. When I was little, before my mother died, we had a few in our yard. I'd help her collect the eggs every morning. It was... She paused, surprised by the sudden tightness in her throat. It was one of the only happy memories I have from that time. Luke reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was achingly tender, and Evelyn found herself frozen, the chick still cupped in her hands, her heart hammering against her ribs. You deserve more happy memories, he said quietly. I'd like to help give you some, if you'll let me. The moment stretched between them, fragile and charged. Evelyn knew she should step back, should maintain the careful distance she'd been trying to preserve. But she didn't want to. She wanted to lean into his touch, to let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this could be something real. Before she could decide, a voice called from outside. Hello, the house! Luke dropped his hand and stepped back, the spell broken. That's Tom Crawford. Wonder what brings him out here. The marshal was dismounting as they stepped onto the porch, and his expression was grave. Luke, Miss Carter, got some news you both should hear. What is it? Luke's voice had gone hard, alert. Got a telegram from the marshal in Laramie. They caught Samuel Reed trying to pull the same scheme up there. He's in custody, awaiting trial. Crawford pulled out a folded paper. Thing is, they found more letters on him, including drafts of ones he'd sent to Evelyn here, with notes in the margins about how to make the con more convincing. Evelyn felt her stomach turn over. Notes? Ways to sound more sincere. Phrases that worked well on previous targets. Details about what kind of woman to look for, desperate enough to be vulnerable, but not so desperate she wouldn't have any money. Crawford's expression was apologetic. I'm sorry, Miss Carter, but you need to know how calculated this was. Reed's a professional predator. She wanted to feel shocked, but instead there was only a dull sort of confirmation. Of course it had been calculated. Of course she'd been selected for her vulnerability. That's what predators did. They found the weak, the isolated, the desperate, and they fed. What happens now? Luke asked, his hand finding the small of Evelyn's back, a steadying presence. They'll try him in Laramie for the crimes committed there, but the prosecutor wants victims to testify if they're willing, show the pattern of behavior. Crawford looked at Evelyn. Would you be willing to come to Laramie, tell your story in court? Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to stay hidden, stay safe, avoid the public humiliation of admitting how thoroughly she'd been fooled. But then she thought about all those letters, all those women who'd been saved because she and Luke had taken the time to warn them. And she thought about the ones they hadn't reached, the ones Reed might have already victimized. Yes, she heard herself say. I'll testify. Luke's hand pressed more firmly against her back. I'll come with you. Luke, you don't need to... I know I don't need to. I want to. You shouldn't have to face this alone. Crawford nodded, looking relieved. Trial's set for 2 weeks from now. I'll send word when we need to leave. He paused. For what it's worth, Miss Carter, what you're doing takes courage. Most folks would just want to forget the whole thing. After he left, Evelyn stood on the porch, staring out at the canyon without really seeing it. She felt Luke's presence beside her, solid and dependable, and found herself leaning slightly into him without conscious thought. I don't feel courageous, she said finally. I feel scared and angry and humiliated. That's what courage is. Doing the thing that terrifies you because it's the right thing to do. He turned to face her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. And you don't have to be strong every minute. You can be scared. You can be angry. You can feel whatever you need to feel. And if I fall apart, then I'll be here to help put you back together. The simple certainty in his voice broke something loose in her chest. Before she could stop herself, she was turning into him, letting him pull her close, burying her face against his shirt, as the tears finally came. All the fear and rage and grief she'd been holding back poured out in shaking sobs while Luke held her steady, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring wordless comfort. "I'm sorry," she gasped when she could finally speak. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't." "Hush. You've got nothing to apologize for. Nothing." He pulled back just enough to tilt her face up, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "You're allowed to break down sometimes, Evelyn. You're allowed to need help. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." She searched his face, seeing nothing but sincerity and something else, something that made her breath catch. "Luke, I know." His voice was rough. "I know this probably isn't the right time, and I know we agreed this was just a business arrangement, but I need you to know you matter to me, not as an employee, not as someone I'm helping out of obligation. As a person I care about, as a woman He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "As someone I'm starting to love." The world seemed to stop spinning. Evelyn stood frozen in his arms, unable to process what she'd just heard. Love. He'd said love. After everything that had happened, after all her careful walls and determined distance, Luke Bennett had looked at her with those steady eyes and said the one word she'd never expected to hear. "Can't mean that," she whispered. "You barely know me. I know you're strong when you need to be and vulnerable when you think no one's looking. I know you saved those chickens I brought home, even though you had every right to wring their necks after they escaped and destroyed your garden. I know you read poetry before bed and sing under your breath while you work and cry during thunderstorms because they remind you of something you won't talk about." He cupped her face gently. "I know enough, Evelyn. Maybe not everything, but enough to know what I feel. I'm not—" She had to stop, had to swallow past the emotion threatening to choke her. "I'm not good at this, at trusting, at opening up, at believing that good things are real and not just traps waiting to spring. I know that too. And I'm not asking you to trust me completely right now, or to feel the same way I do, or to promise me anything. I'm just telling you the truth. What you do with it is up to you." Evelyn closed her eyes, trying to steady herself against the rush of feelings, terror and hope and longing all tangled together. She'd been so certain she could keep her heart locked away, could maintain the boundaries that kept her safe. But Luke had slipped past her defenses without even trying, had become essential to her in ways she was only now beginning to understand. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "I'm afraid of wanting this and losing it. I'm afraid of being wrong again, of misreading everything, of waking up one day and finding out this was all some elaborate lie." "That's Reed talking, not your instincts. You know I'm not him." "Do I? How can I be sure? He seemed sincere, too. He seemed real." Luke was quiet for a long moment. Then he released her, taking a step back, and Evelyn felt the loss of his warmth like a physical ache. "You can't be sure. Not completely. Trust is a choice, Evelyn, and it's always a risk. But I can tell you this. I will never lie to you. I will never deliberately hurt you. And if I ever do hurt you accidentally, you can walk away and I won't try to stop you. Those are the only promises I can make." She looked at him standing there in the fading light. This man who'd ridden through the dawn and changed everything. This man who'd taken her in when he had no reason to, who'd helped her warn strangers of danger, who'd held her while she cried and told her she was allowed to be human. This man who was offering her something she'd never had. Not security born of desperation, but genuine care with no strings attached. It was terrifying. It was impossible. It was everything she'd never let herself want. "I can't promise you anything either," she said finally. "I can't promise I'll be easy to love, or that I won't panic and run, or that I'll ever be able to say the words you want to hear, but I can promise to try. To stay, to be honest, to let you in as much as I'm able. Is that enough?" Luke's face transformed, relief and joy and something deeper flooding his expression. "That's more than enough. That's everything." He reached for her again, and this time when he pulled her close, Evelyn let herself sink into the embrace without reservation. She wrapped her arms around his waist and held on tight, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong against her ear, letting herself believe, just for this moment, that maybe happy endings weren't just stories people told to make the darkness bearable. They stood like that until the sun had fully set and the stars began to emerge, until the cold drove them back inside where the fire had burned low. Luke built it back up while Evelyn made dinner, and they ate in a comfortable silence that felt different now, charged with new understanding. Later, as Evelyn prepared to retire to her room, Luke caught her hand. "Evelyn, thank you for trusting me enough to try. Thank you for being worth the risk." She left him standing by the fire and walked across the dark yard to her small room, her heart both lighter and heavier than it had been that morning. She'd opened a door she'd kept firmly locked for years, and there was no closing it now. Whatever came next, whether joy or heartbreak or something in between, she'd have to face it openly, honestly, without the armor of indifference she'd relied on for so long. It was the most terrifying thing she'd ever done. The 2 weeks before the trial passed too quickly and too slowly at the same time. Evelyn found herself hyper-aware of Luke's presence, noticing things she'd overlooked before. The way he always made sure she ate enough, the careful distance he maintained, never pushing, never presuming, always waiting for her to close the gap between them. The small gestures of affection, a hand on her shoulder as he passed, a smile that was just for her, the way he'd started reading aloud in the evenings from one of her poetry books. She was falling. She knew it even as she tried to deny it, even as fear whispered that this couldn't be real, couldn't last, would end in disaster. But every day that passed without disaster made the fear a little quieter, made the hope a little stronger. One evening, about a week before they were due to leave for Laramie, Evelyn was washing dishes when Luke came up behind her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel his presence, warm and solid at her back. "Can I ask you something?" His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Of course." "That night at the station, when you were waiting, if Reed had shown up, if he'd been real, would you have gone through with it? Married him?" Evelyn's hand stilled in the water. It was a question she'd asked herself dozens of times, but never answered honestly. "I don't know. I wanted to believe I would, that I was brave enough, or desperate enough, or practical enough. But the truth is, all night long, part of me was hoping he wouldn't come, because marrying a stranger, even for security, felt like giving up the last piece of myself that was still mine. And now? The truth is, all night long, part of me was hoping he wouldn't come, because marrying a stranger, even for security, felt like giving up the last piece of myself that was still mine. And now? Now I think maybe I was waiting for the wrong thing, or the wrong person, or maybe just waiting for someone to show me that there was another option I hadn't considered." She turned to face him, her hands dripping soapy water. "Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense." Luke reached out, tucking a stray hair behind her ear in a gesture that was becoming familiar. "For what it's worth, I'm glad he didn't show up. I'm glad you were there on that platform, even though I hate that you had to go through that pain, because otherwise I'd still be here alone, half alive, going through the motions without really living. You changed that. I didn't do anything except show up and fall apart." "You showed up. That's more than most people manage. And you didn't fall apart. You kept going even when you had every reason to quit. That's strength, Evelyn. Real strength. Not the kind that pretends nothing hurts." She wanted to argue, to deflect the praise as she always did. But instead she let herself accept it, let herself believe that maybe he was right. Maybe surviving wasn't the same as giving up. Maybe asking for help wasn't weakness. Maybe she was stronger than she'd given herself credit for. "Kiss me," she whispered, surprising herself with the boldness. Luke's eyes widened, and for a moment she thought he might refuse, might insist they wait or take things slower. But then his hands were cupping her face, and he was leaning in, giving her time to change her mind, to pull away, to say no. She didn't say no. His lips met hers gently, almost questioningly, as if he was still afraid of pushing too hard too fast. But Evelyn leaned into the kiss, her soapy hands coming up to grip his shirt, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. This was real. This was happening. And it was nothing like she'd imagined, not desperate or frantic or driven by need. It was soft and sweet and achingly tender, a promise rather than a demand. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks." "Why didn't you?" "Because I wanted you to want it too. Wanted you to choose me, Not just accept me because I was here and convenient. I'm choosing you, Evelyn said firmly. Maybe I don't completely understand what I'm choosing or where this leads, but I'm choosing you, Luke Bennett, for whatever that's worth. It's worth everything. He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Evelyn felt the last of her carefully constructed walls crumble into dust. They stood in the kitchen for a long time afterward, just holding each other, neither wanting to break the spell. Finally, reluctantly, Evelyn stepped back. I should finish the dishes. Leave them. They'll keep until morning. Luke, please, just stay here with me for a while longer. We don't have to do anything. Don't have to talk. Just be here. So she stayed, letting him lead her to the fireside where they sat together on the rough wooden floor, her back against his chest, his arms wrapped around her. They watched the flames dance and listened to the wind outside, and Evelyn felt something she'd never felt before, a sense of belonging so profound it was almost painful. This was what she'd been looking for without knowing it, not security or survival, but connection. Someone who saw her completely and chose her anyway. Someone she could be weak with, be honest with, be herself with. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. It was home. The night before they left for Laramie, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about facing Samuel Reed in court, about having to recount her humiliation in front of strangers, about the possibility that her testimony might not be enough to convict him. Finally, unable to bear her thoughts any longer, she pulled on her shawl and slipped outside. The canyon was silver with moonlight, beautiful and stark. She walked without thinking, her feet carrying her to the cabin door. Luke answered her knock immediately, as if he'd been awake waiting. He took one look at her face and stepped aside. Come in. I couldn't sleep. Neither could I. He guided her to the chair by the fire, then poured her coffee that was somehow still hot. Worried about tomorrow? Terrified. She wrapped her hands around the mug. What if I can't do it? What if I freeze up or say the wrong thing or... You won't. Luke crouched in front of her, his hands covering hers. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met, Evelyn Carter. You'll walk into that courtroom and you'll tell the truth, and whatever happens after that isn't your responsibility. You'll have done your part. Will you be there? In the courtroom? Every minute, right behind you. And when it's over, we'll come back here and we'll keep building this life we've started, together. Together. The word settled over her like a benediction. I like the sound of that. So do I. He stood, pulling her up with him. Try to get some sleep. We've got a long ride ahead tomorrow. But instead of leaving, Evelyn found herself stepping closer, looking up into his face. Stay with me tonight? Just hold me? She saw him war with himself, saw desire and honor battle in his expression. Evelyn, if I stay, people will talk. Your reputation has already been shredded by gossip, and I don't care. I need you tonight, Luke. Not for anything improper, just to not be alone with my fear. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but we do this properly. You in your bed, me in a chair beside it, and the door stays open. It wasn't what she'd meant, but she didn't argue. They walked across to her room together, and Luke made good on his word, settling into the old wooden chair while she climbed under Anna's quilt. The arrangement was chaste, proper, utterly respectable. It was also exactly what she needed. Tell me a story, she whispered into the darkness. Something happy. Something that has nothing to do with con men, or trials, or fear. Luke was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then his voice came soft and low, weaving words into images. When I was 10, my brother and I snuck out one night to catch fireflies. We'd made jars with holes punched in the lids, and we were determined to catch enough to make a lantern. Spent hours running through the fields, our hands glowing every time we cupped a firefly, our mother calling for us to come home. His voice washed over her, steady and soothing, and Evelyn felt herself finally beginning to relax. She let the story carry her away from her worries, let herself imagine Luke as a boy running through summer fields, let herself believe in a future where she might hear dozens more stories just like this one. Somewhere in the middle of a tale about a fishing trip gone comically wrong, she drifted off. The last thing she remembered was the gentle rumble of Luke's voice and the profound sense of safety that came from knowing he would still be there when she woke. And he was. When dawnlight crept through her window, she opened her eyes to find him still in the chair, his head tilted back in sleep, his hands stretched out toward her bed, as if even unconscious he'd been trying to reach her. "Luke," she whispered, and his eyes opened immediately, alert despite the awkward position he'd spent the night in. "Morning. How are you feeling?" "Nervous, but ready." She sat up, pushing back the quilt. "Thank you for staying. Anytime you need me, I'm here. Remember that." They prepared for the journey in quiet efficiency, packing supplies and saddling horses. As the sun climbed higher, they mounted up and began the long ride to Laramie, leaving the canyon behind. Evelyn looked back once, fixing the image of the cabin in her mind. Whatever happened at the trial, whatever came next, this place was home now. And the man riding beside her, steady, patient, impossibly kind, he was home too. She would face Samuel Reed. She would tell her truth. And then she would come back here and keep building this new life, one day at a time, with a cowboy who'd ridden through the dawn and taught her what it meant to be chosen, to be valued, to be loved. The future was uncertain, terrifying, full of risk. But for the first time in her life, Evelyn found herself looking forward to it anyway. The ride to Laramie took 2 full days, and they spent the first night camped under stars so brilliant they seemed close enough to touch. Luke built a fire while Evelyn unpacked their supplies, and they ate a simple meal of beans and hardtack in companionable silence. The vastness of the prairie stretched around them in every direction, making Evelyn feel simultaneously insignificant and strangely free. "You're quiet," Luke observed as they sat by the fire afterward. "Having second thoughts?" "About testifying? No. About everything else? Constantly." She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders against the chill. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong, for this to turn out to be another mistake, another misjudgment. That's fear talking, not wisdom. There's a difference." "How do you tell which is which?" Luke poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward into the darkness. "Fear tells you everything will go wrong. Wisdom tells you things might go wrong and helps you prepare for it. Fear paralyzes. Wisdom empowers." He glanced at her. "Which one are you feeling right now?" Evelyn considered. "Both, I think. Fear that I'm wrong about you, about us, but also the wisdom that even if I am wrong, I'll survive it. I've survived worse." "You have, but for what it's worth, you're not wrong about me. I'm exactly who I appear to be. No hidden agendas, no secret schemes. Just a man who's been alone too long and found someone who makes him want to stop being alone." "That simple?" "That's simple." He set aside the stick. "I'm not complicated, Evelyn. What you see is what you get. I work hard, I keep my word, and I try to do right by people. Sometimes I fail, but I keep trying. That's all there is to me." She studied him in the firelight, this man who'd become so essential to her in such a short time. He was right. There was a fundamental straightforwardness to Luke Bennett that was both reassuring and slightly terrifying. No layers to peel back, no masks to remove. Just honest, solid, real. "I don't know how to be that simple," she admitted. "I've spent so much of my life hiding, protecting myself, pretending to be stronger or less vulnerable than I really am. I'm not sure I remember how to just be myself." "Then practice. Start small. Tell me one true thing about yourself that you've never told anyone else." Evelyn's first instinct was to deflect, to make a joke or change the subject, but she'd promised to try, to let him in, to be honest. "I'm afraid of thunderstorms because the night my mother died, there was a terrible storm. I was hiding under my bed, terrified, and I could hear her screaming in the next room. By the time the storm passed, she was gone, and I've been afraid ever since, not of the thunder itself, but of what it represents. That terrible things can happen while you're cowering in the dark, unable to help, unable to change anything." Luke was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the space between them and took her hand. "Thank you for telling me, and I'm sorry you had to go through that alone." "I've gone through most things alone. It's what I know." "Not anymore. Not if you don't want to." He squeezed her hand gently. "I can't promise to fix everything or make all your fears disappear, but I can promise you won't have to face them alone anymore." Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes, but these were different from the tears she'd shed before. These were tears of relief, of being seen and accepted, of finding an unexpected harbor in a storm-tossed life. How did you get to be so good at this? At what? At saying exactly what I need to hear. At knowing how to reach me when I'm trying to keep everyone at a distance. Luke smiled, and the expression transformed his usually serious face. Maybe I'm not particularly good at it. Maybe you're just particularly worth the effort. They sat together until the fire burned low and exhaustion began to pull at them. Luke spread out his bedroll on one side of the dying flames, and Evelyn arranged hers on the other, the distance between them somehow more pronounced than when they'd been sitting close. She lay awake for a long time, listening to his breathing even out into sleep, feeling the absence of his presence like a physical ache. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, she spoke into the darkness. "Luke, are you awake?" "Yeah, can't sleep?" "No, I keep thinking about tomorrow, about facing Reed, about what happens after." She heard him shift, and then his voice came closer. "Want me to come over there? Just to talk, I mean." "Please." He crossed the space between them and settled beside her bedroll, close enough that she could feel his warmth but not touching. "What are you most afraid of?" "That I'll see him and all my certainty will crumble. That I'll remember why I fell for his lies and I'll start doubting everything, my judgment, my worth, my ability to tell truth from fiction." She paused. "That I'll see him and realize I'm still that desperate woman who answered a stranger's letter because she couldn't imagine any other way forward. You're not that woman anymore. You were never that woman. You were someone dealt a bad hand who made the best choice she could with the information she had. And now you're someone who's choosing to stand up and make sure he can't hurt anyone else. That's not desperation, Evelyn. That's courage." "It doesn't feel like courage. It feels like I'm barely holding myself together." "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's being terrified and doing the thing anyway." He was quiet for a moment. "You want to know what I think when I look at you?" "What?" "I think about how you stepped off that train with nothing but hope and $50. I think about how you sat alone all night waiting for someone who never came. And instead of falling apart completely, you got angry. I think about how you took a chance on a stranger who offered you shelter, even though you had every reason not to trust men. I think about how you read through all those letters from women you'd never met and felt their pain deeply enough to spend weeks trying to save them from the same fate." His voice was rough with emotion. "When I look at you, I see someone extraordinary, someone who's been beaten down by life but refuses to stay down. And I wonder what I did to deserve having you in my life." Evelyn couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. She reached out blindly and found his hand, lacing their fingers together. "You saved me. We saved each other. And tomorrow, you're going to walk into that courtroom and you're going to save a lot of other women by making sure Reed pays for what he did. You're going to be magnificent. Will you hold me, just until I fall asleep?" He didn't answer with words, just shifted so he could gather her against his chest, one arm wrapped securely around her waist. Evelyn tucked her head under his chin and let herself relax into his embrace, feeling safer than she had in her entire life. "Tell me about your family," she murmured, not ready for sleep yet despite her exhaustion. "Your sisters and brother. What are they like?" Luke's voice rumbled in his chest, the vibration soothing against her ear. "Sarah's the oldest, practical, bossy, thinks she knows what's best for everyone and is usually right. She married a farmer, has 4 kids, runs her household like a general commanding troops. Then there's Margaret, who's quiet and bookish, always has her nose in some novel or poetry collection. She teaches at a small school near Sarah, and my brother Thomas is the baby, though he'd punch anyone who called him that now. He's working on the railroad, moving around too much to settle anywhere." "Do you miss them?" "Sometimes, but we all needed to go our separate ways after the war. Too much had changed. We'd all seen and done things that made it hard to go back to being who we'd been before." He paused. "Sarah writes me every few months, trying to convince me to come back to Missouri. Says I've been alone long enough that I should find a nice girl and settle down properly." "What do you tell her?" "That I'm happy where I am. Or I was. I am now, anyway. For a long time after Anna died, I wasn't sure I'd ever be happy again. Thought maybe I'd used up my allotment of happiness, and the rest was just going through the motions. His arm tightened around her. Then a stubborn woman showed up on a train platform and reminded me that there's always the possibility of something new, something unexpected, something worth having. I'm glad I showed up, Evelyn whispered, even if it was for all the wrong reasons. Maybe there are no wrong reasons. Maybe everything happens the way it's supposed to, even when it doesn't make sense at the time. She wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe that her mother's death and her father's drinking and years in the orphanage and the soul-crushing work at the laundry and Samuel Reed's betrayal had all been leading her here, to this moment, to this man. But it seemed too neat, too convenient. Life wasn't a story with a clear moral and tidy ending. Still, as she drifted towards sleep with Luke's heartbeat steady beneath her ear and his arms solid around her, she let herself pretend it might be true. Just for tonight. She woke to find herself alone in her bedroll, the sun already climbing above the horizon. Luke was building up the fire, and the smell of coffee was drifting through the cool morning air. "Morning," he said when he saw her stirring. "Thought I'd let you sleep as long as possible. We've got time before we need to leave." Evelyn sat up, pushing her hair out of her face and trying not to think about how she must look after sleeping on the ground. "What time is it?" "Little after 6. We should reach Laramie by mid-afternoon if we make good time." They ate a quick breakfast and broke camp efficiently, falling back into the easy partnership that had developed between them over the past weeks. As they rode, Evelyn found her anxiety building with each mile that brought them closer to the city. Her hands were clammy on the reins, and her stomach churned with nervousness. "Talk to me," Luke said after they'd been riding in silence for over an hour. "What's going through your head?" "I'm rehearsing what I'll say, trying to anticipate what questions they'll ask, how Reed's lawyer will try to discredit me." She swallowed hard. "Trying to prepare myself to see him again." "You don't owe him anything, Evelyn. Not politeness, not understanding, not even eye contact. You walk in there, you tell the truth, and you walk back out. That's all." "What if the jury doesn't believe me?" "Then they're fools. But I've seen you handle Clara Morrison and her gossips. I've watched you stand up to your own fears and doubts. You're convincing when you speak the truth because it's so clearly the truth. Anyone with eyes will see that." Laramie appeared on the horizon around 2 o'clock, larger and more bustling than Stillwater. The streets were crowded with wagons and riders, and the buildings were more substantial, brick and stone instead of rough wood. Luke led them to a modest hotel near the courthouse, and Evelyn was grateful when he arranged for separate rooms without her having to ask. Propriety might seem pointless given how much time they spent alone together at the ranch, but she appreciated the gesture nonetheless. "The trial starts tomorrow at 9, Luke said after they'd settled in. "Marshal Crawford is meeting us for dinner tonight to go over what to expect. But until then, you should rest. Try not to think about it too much." "Easy for you to say." He smiled. "I didn't say it would be easy, just that you should try." Evelyn spent the afternoon in her room, alternating between pacing and staring out the window at the unfamiliar city. She tried reading, but couldn't focus. Tried napping, but couldn't relax. Finally, she gave up and just sat with her anxiety, letting it wash over her without trying to fight it. Marshal Crawford met them in the hotel dining room that evening, looking tired but determined. "Everything's set for tomorrow. The prosecutor's a good man, Daniel Whitmore, and he's prepared a solid case. Reed's lawyer is going to try to paint him as a misunderstood businessman, but we've got enough evidence to counter that." "How many other victims are testifying?" Evelyn asked, pushing food around her plate without really eating. 3, including you. A widow from Denver who lost her savings. A young woman from Cheyenne who was saved by your warning telegram. She's testifying about the letter she received and how it matches the pattern. And you, representing the Stillwater case." Crawford paused. "Reed's lawyer already tried to get your testimony excluded, claiming it's prejudicial since no actual crime was committed against you, but the judge denied it. You're testifying." Evelyn felt her stomach flip. "What if I mess up? What if I say something that hurts the case?" "You won't. Just tell the truth, exactly what happened, exactly how you felt, exactly what losses you suffered. The prosecutor will guide you through it." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Miss Carter, I've been a lawman for 15 years. I've seen a lot of victims testify, and I can tell you, your honesty, Your willingness to be vulnerable about what happened, that's going to be powerful, more powerful than any polished performance could be. After dinner, Luke walked her back to her room. They stood in the hallway, neither quite ready to say goodnight. "I meant what I said last night," Luke said finally. "You're going to be magnificent tomorrow. But even if you weren't, even if you stumbled over every word, I'd still be proud of you for trying. Stay with me tonight?" The words were out before Evelyn could stop them. I don't mean just like last night. I don't want to be alone." Luke glanced down the hallway, clearly weighing propriety against her need. "Your room or mine?" "Yours. If people are going to talk, better they think you're compromising me than the other way around." He laughed softly. Always practical. "All right, give me 5 minutes to make sure the room's presentable, then come down." His room was nearly identical to hers. Simple, clean, functional. Luke had pulled the single chair over to the window, and he gestured to the bed. "You take that. I'll be right here." "Luke, that's ridiculous. We've already established that we're not going to do anything improper. Just—" She sat on the bed and patted the space beside her. "Sit with me, please." He hesitated, then complied, settling beside her with careful space between them. They sat in awkward silence for a moment before Evelyn gave up and leaned against his shoulder. "Better," she murmured. "Much better." His arm came around her, and they shifted until they were lying down, still fully clothed, his chest supporting her back. "Try to sleep. Morning will come soon enough." But sleep wouldn't come. Evelyn lay in the dark, feeling Luke's breath even out behind her, and tried to quiet her racing mind. Finally, she spoke. "Luke, tell me something about after. About what happens when we go back to the canyon. What do you want to know?" "Anything. Everything. What the canyon looks like in winter. What we'll do when spring comes. What normal looks like for us." Luke was quiet for a moment, thinking. Winter's coming soon. The snow will close us in for weeks at a time, and we'll spend a lot of time by the fire. We'll read together. You can work through that stack of books you keep eyeing in the general store. I'll teach you to play chess if you want. We'll make plans for the spring planting, argue about what vegetables to grow, probably get into a ridiculous debate about whether chickens are worth the trouble. Despite her anxiety, Evelyn smiled. "They're absolutely worth the trouble." "That's because you haven't dealt with them in winter yet. Wait until you're breaking ice off their water 3 times a day in a blizzard, then tell me they're worth it." She could hear the smile in his voice. "Spring will come eventually, though it takes its time up here. We'll plant that garden, and you'll probably redesign the whole thing because my system makes no sense. The creek will flood, and we'll spend a week shoring up the banks and cursing the water. Calves will be born, and you'll name every single one even though I'll tell you not to get attached." "Will I listen?" "Not even a little bit. By summer you'll have names for all the chickens too, probably half the horses, and you'll have convinced me to rescue some abandoned animal that will make our lives unnecessarily complicated." "That sounds perfect." "It does, doesn't it?" His arms tightened around her. "That's what I see when I think about the future, Evelyn. Not grand adventures or dramatic moments, just everyday life with you. Ordinary things made extraordinary because we're doing them together. What if I want more than that? What if ordinary isn't enough? Then we'll figure out what more looks like for us. Start a bigger operation, travel sometimes, help more women like the ones in those letters. Whatever you want, we'll work toward it together." He paused. "But I have a feeling you're going to discover that ordinary with the right person is actually pretty extraordinary all on its own." Evelyn thought about that, about quiet mornings and shared meals and arguments about chickens, about building something stable and lasting out of the ruins of broken dreams, about choosing someone every day in 100 small ways and being chosen in return. "I think you might be right." "Of course I'm right. I'm always right." She elbowed him gently. "Now you're just being insufferable." "You like insufferable." "I'm starting to, yes." They fell silent again, but this time the silence was comfortable, peaceful. Evelyn felt her anxiety begin to ease, replaced by a cautious hope. Tomorrow would be difficult. She would have to face Samuel Reed, would have to relive her humiliation in front of strangers, would have to be strong when she felt weak. But she could do it. She would do it. And when it was over, she would go home, real home, not just a place she was staying, with a man who'd taught her what it meant to be loved without conditions. The thought steadied her, and she finally drifted off to sleep with Luke's heartbeat keeping time beneath her ear and his arms anchoring her safely in the present. Morning came too soon and too slowly at the same time. Evelyn woke to find herself alone, Luke already up and moving around the room. He'd brought coffee and breakfast from downstairs, and he was setting it out on the small table with careful precision. "Thought you'd need fuel today, he said when he saw her stirring. "It's going to be a long day." She sat up, smoothing her hair self-consciously. "What time is it?" 7. We need to be at the courthouse by 8:30. He brought her the coffee. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified, sick, ready to run in the opposite direction." She took the coffee gratefully. "But also determined. I want this over with." "That's all you need. Just hang on to that determination when things get hard." They dressed in their respective rooms, and Evelyn took extra care with her appearance. She wanted to look respectable, competent, believable. Not the desperate woman who'd answered Reed's letter, but the strong woman she was becoming. She braided her hair severely, pinned it in a crown around her head, and put on her best dress, simple but clean and well-maintained. When she met Luke in the hallway, his eyes widened slightly. "You look like someone the jury will believe." "I was going to say beautiful, but that works too." He offered his arm. "Ready?" "As I'll ever be." The courthouse was an imposing brick building in the center of town, and the courtroom itself was already filling with spectators when they arrived. Marshal Crawford met them at the door and led them to seats near the front. "The prosecutor wants to meet with you before we start," he told Evelyn, "just to go over the order of questions. Nothing to worry about." Daniel Whitmore turned out to be a lean man in his 40s with sharp eyes and a kind smile. He shook Evelyn's hand firmly and led her to a small side room where they could speak privately. "Miss Carter, I want you to know that I've read your statement and the letters Reed wrote to you. What he did to you and the others was reprehensible, and I intend to make sure he pays for it." He sat across from her, his expression earnest. "But I need you to understand, his lawyer is going to try to make you look foolish. He'll suggest you were complicit, that you should have known better, that no real harm was done since you didn't actually give Reed any money. Can you handle that?" Evelyn lifted her chin. "I've been handling people judging me my entire life, Mr. Whitmore. I can handle it for a few more hours." "Good. Then let's go over what I'll be asking you." They spent 20 minutes reviewing her testimony, and then it was time. Luke was waiting outside, and he took her hand as they walked back into the courtroom. The gallery had filled completely now, and Evelyn could feel dozens of eyes on her as they took their seats. Then the bailiff called for everyone to rise, and the judge entered. And finally, horribly, Samuel Reed was led in. Evelyn's breath caught. He looked smaller than she remembered, less impressive. Just a man in his 30s with ordinary features and expensive clothes. Nothing remarkable or special about him. How had she ever believed his lies? How had this unremarkable con artist convinced her he was worth uprooting her entire life? But then he turned and his eyes met hers, and she saw it. The cold calculation, the predatory assessment, the complete lack of remorse. He looked at her the way someone might look at a horse they were considering buying, evaluating her worth, her usefulness, her potential vulnerability. And she knew with sudden clarity that she hadn't been foolish to believe him. She'd been human. She'd wanted to believe in the possibility of something better, and he'd exploited that fundamental human hope with the skill of someone who'd done it dozens of times before. She wasn't the fool. He was the monster. The realization steadied her, and when the prosecutor called her name an hour later, she stood without trembling. Luke squeezed her hand once, and then she was walking forward, climbing into the witness box, placing her hand on the Bible to swear to tell the truth. Whitmore approached her with a reassuring smile. "Miss Carter, thank you for being here today. I know this isn't easy. Can you start by telling the court how you came to know the defendant?" Evelyn took a breath and began. She told them about the laundry, about the exhaustion, and the fear of growing old alone and impoverished. She told them about seeing Reed's advertisement, about the letters they'd exchanged, about the promises he'd made. She described packing her entire life into a single trunk, quitting her job, spending her savings on train fare to come to Wyoming. She recounted the long night on the platform, the dawn arrival of Luke Bennett, The discovery that Reed was a con artist who'd never intended to marry her at all. Whitmore guided her through it all with gentle questions, and Evelyn found herself speaking more easily than she'd expected. The truth had its own momentum, its own power. She wasn't performing or trying to convince anyone. She was simply telling what had happened. "And did Mr. Reed ask you to bring money with you?" Whitmore asked. "Yes, $50. He said it was for wedding expenses and initial supplies." "Did you bring it?" "I did. I had it sewn into the lining of my trunk." "And did Mr. Reed ever receive this money?" "No, I still have it." "But you would have given it to him if he'd appeared at the station as promised?" "Yes, that was the agreement." Whitmore nodded. "Miss Carter, can you tell the court what losses you suffered as a result of Mr. Reed's deception?" Evelyn considered. "I lost my job, which I can't get back because I gave notice and they've already hired my replacement. I lost my savings and train fare. I lost my reputation. There are people in Stillwater who think I'm a foolish woman of loose morals because I came west to marry a stranger. But mostly," she paused, meeting Reed's eyes directly for the first time. "Mostly I lost my ability to trust easily, my faith in people's basic decency, my belief that sometimes good things happen to people who've had nothing but hard luck. Those are losses you can't quantify in dollars, but they're real nonetheless." "Thank you, Miss Carter." Whitmore returned to his seat. "Your witness." Reed's lawyer stood, a slick-looking man with pomaded hair and an expression that suggested he found this entire proceeding tedious. "Miss Carter, isn't it true that you answered my client's advertisement of your own free will?" "Yes." "And that you chose to leave your employment and travel to Wyoming without any guarantee of what you'd find here?" "I had Mr. Reed's letter promising marriage. That seemed like a guarantee." "But you never met him, never verified his claims, never asked for references or proof of his property. You simply took a stranger's word and acted on it. Isn't that rather imprudent?" Evelyn felt anger kindle in her chest. "What's imprudent is blaming victims for the crimes committed against them. I took what I thought was a reasonable risk based on information your client provided. If that information was false, and we both know it was, that's his crime, not my foolishness." "But no crime was actually committed against you, was it? You still have your $50. You found employment with another man," he said another man with heavy innuendo. "So you haven't even suffered economically. What exactly are you claiming damages for?" "Objection," Whitmore said sharply, argumentative and harassing the witness. "Sustained. Mr. Carlyle, keep your questions appropriate." But the lawyer just smiled. "I'll rephrase, Miss Carter. Isn't it true that you're now living with Mr. Luke Bennett in an unmarried state?" Evelyn felt her face flush but kept her voice steady. "I'm employed by Mr. Bennett as his housekeeper. I have my own separate quarters." "How very proper. And yet you traveled here with him, stayed in the same hotel. Some might say you simply traded one questionable arrangement for another." "Objection!" Whitmore was on his feet. "The witness's current living situation is irrelevant to whether my client committed fraud. I'm trying to establish the witness's character and credibility. Then do so without insinuations and innuendo." "Objection sustained. The jury will disregard counsel's last statement." But the damage was done. Evelyn could see some of the jury members looking at her with new speculation, could feel the weight of judgment settling over her. This was what she'd feared, being made to feel that somehow Reed's crimes were her fault, that her circumstances made her unworthy of justice. She glanced back at Luke and found him staring at Reed's lawyer with barely contained fury. His hands were clenched on the railing in front of him, and she could see the muscle jumping in his jaw. For a moment she worried he might actually vault over the railing and do something they'd both regret. But then his eyes met hers, and she saw him consciously relax, saw him mouth the words, "You've got this." She turned back to face the lawyer with renewed determination. Let him try to discredit her. Let him suggest she was foolish or desperate or morally compromised. She knew the truth. Luke knew the truth. And she suspected the jury, despite their curiosity, knew it too. "Is there an actual question, Mr. Carlyle?" she asked coolly. "Or are you just enjoying making speeches?" A ripple of surprised laughter ran through the courtroom, and the judge's lips twitched. The lawyer's face reddened. I think we're done with this witness, Your Honor. Very well. Miss Carter, you're excused. Thank you for your testimony. Evelyn stood on shaking legs and walked back to her seat with as much dignity as she could muster. Luke's hand found hers immediately, warm and solid and real, anchoring her. You were perfect, he whispered. Absolutely perfect. She watched the rest of the trial through a haze of exhaustion and relief. The widow from Denver testified tearfully about losing her life savings. The woman from Cheyenne explained how Evelyn's warning telegram had saved her from making the same mistake. A string of character witnesses from Stillwater testified about Reed's deceptions there, about the money he'd stolen, about the trail of destruction he'd left behind. Through it all, Samuel Reed sat impassively, showing no emotion, no remorse, no acknowledgement that he'd done anything wrong. He was a predator who saw his victims as nothing more than resources to be exploited, and Evelyn realized with startling clarity that she'd gotten off lightly. She'd lost money and time and some of her innocence, but she still had her life, her strength, her ability to move forward. Other women might not have been so fortunate. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all counts. Samuel Reed was sentenced to 10 years hard labor, and as they led him away in chains, he looked back at the courtroom one last time. His eyes found Evelyn's, and for just a moment she saw something flicker there. Not remorse, but perhaps acknowledgement. She'd beaten him. She and all the other women he'd tried to destroy had stood up and won. Outside the courthouse, Marshal Crawford shook both their hands. That was well done, Miss Carter. Your testimony was crucial. Thank you for believing me, for believing all of us. Justice doesn't work if people aren't willing to stand up and tell the truth. You did that. Be proud. Luke guided her away from the crowd, his arm protectively around her waist. How are you holding up? I'm okay. Tired, but okay. She leaned into him. Can we go home now? Absolutely. We'll stay tonight. Leave first thing in the morning. He paused. You were incredible in there. The way you handled that lawyer. I was terrified. You were brave. There's a difference. He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. Evelyn, I know this isn't the most romantic setting, but I need to say this now. I love you, not just as someone I'm helping or someone I care about. I'm in love with you. And when we get back to the canyon, I want to start building a real future with you, not as employer and employee, as partners, as... He took a breath. As husband and wife, if you'll have me. Evelyn stared at him, her heart suddenly pounding. Luke? You don't have to answer now. Think about it on the ride home. But I wanted you to know. I want you to know where I stand, what I'm offering. It's not much, just a small ranch and a man who'll probably never be rich or important. But it's real, and it's yours if you want it. She should tell him she needed time, should be practical, cautious, protect herself from potential hurt. But standing there in the afternoon sun with this man who'd ridden through the dawn and changed everything, she found she didn't want to be cautious anymore. Yes, she said simply. Luke blinked. Yes? Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll build a future with you. Yes to all of it. She smiled at his shocked expression. Did you think I'd say no? I thought you'd need time to think about it. I've been thinking about it for weeks now. I just wasn't ready to admit it. But I'm done being afraid, Luke. I'm done protecting myself from happiness because I'm worried it might not last. I want this. I want you. I want us. And then he was kissing her right there on the street in front of the courthouse, and half of Laramie, and Evelyn was kissing him back without caring who saw or what they thought. This was real. This was right. This was the future she'd been too afraid to hope for finally becoming present reality. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Luke rested his forehead against hers. We're doing this. We're really doing this. We really are. When? As soon as possible. I don't want to wait. She paused. Is that too forward? Should we have a proper courtship? Do things the traditional way? The traditional way would have been me courting you for a year, asking your father's permission, having a big church wedding with half the territory in attendance. But nothing about us has been traditional, and I don't see why we should start now. He grinned. How about we stop by the church on our way out of town tomorrow? See if the minister's available for a quick ceremony." "That sounds perfect." They spent the evening planning in Luke's hotel room, discussing practical details with the giddy excitement of people who'd been given an unexpected gift. There would need to be a legal marriage certificate, witnesses, perhaps some basic celebration back in Stillwater so people knew their arrangement was now entirely proper. But the details didn't matter nearly as much as the fundamental shift that had occurred. They were building something together now, not cautiously, not holding back pieces of themselves for protection, but fully and completely. "I wish Anna could have met you," Luke said as they lay together in the dark, properly on top of the blankets with their clothes on, maintaining at least some semblance of propriety. "She'd have liked you, would have appreciated how you don't take any nonsense from anyone." "Do you think she'd approve?" "Of us?" Luke was quiet for a moment. "I think she'd be happy I found someone who makes me want to live fully again, instead of just surviving, and I think she'd tell me I'm a fool if I let you get away." "Then I suppose it's a good thing I'm not going anywhere." "Best decision you ever made, saying yes to me." Evelyn laughed. "Second best. First best was getting on that train to Wyoming, even if it was for all the wrong reasons." "Maybe there are no wrong reasons. Maybe it all led exactly where it needed to." She thought about that, about all the pain and struggle and fear that had brought her to this moment, about how she wouldn't change any of it, because changing it would mean never meeting Luke, never finding this unexpected happiness. "Maybe you're right." They talked long into the night, about everything and nothing, making plans and dreaming dreams and slowly learning how to be partners instead of two separate people orbiting around each other. And when Evelyn finally fell asleep in Luke's arms, she dreamed not of trains and abandonment, but of dawn breaking over a canyon that felt like home. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through the hotel window, and Evelyn woke to find Luke already awake, watching her with an expression so tender it made her heart ache. "Have you been staring at me all night like some kind of strange sentinel?" she asked, her voice still rough with sleep. "Only for the last hour or so. Wanted to make sure you were real, that I didn't dream the part where you agreed to marry me. I'm real. This is real." She reached up to touch his face, feeling the rough stubble under her palm. "And yes, I'm still saying yes in the cold light of morning." "Good, because I already spoke to the hotel clerk about where to find a minister, and he gave me directions to Reverend Patterson's church. Said the man's usually available for marriages on short notice if we can provide witnesses." Evelyn sat up, suddenly nervous. "Luke, are you sure about this? Moving so fast, I mean. We could wait, do things properly." "I'm 32 years old, Evelyn. I've already had one engagement that followed all the proper rules and timelines. I know what I want, and I know I want it with you. But if you need more time—" "No!" She cut him off firmly. "No, I don't need more time. I just wanted to make sure you didn't feel rushed." "The only thing I feel is grateful." He kissed her forehead. "Now get dressed. We've got a wedding to arrange." The church was a modest white structure on the edge of town, with a small cemetery beside it and flowers planted along the walkway. Reverend Patterson turned out to be an elderly man with kind eyes and a warm smile who didn't seem at all surprised when Luke explained their situation. "Happens more often than you'd think out here," he said, gesturing for them to sit in the front pew. "People meet, know what they want, don't see the point in unnecessary delay. The Lord works in his own time, and sometimes his time is faster than society expects." He pulled out a worn Bible and a marriage register. "Now, I'll need to know your full names, and we'll need 2 witnesses. Do you have anyone in mind?" Luke frowned. "I hadn't thought that far ahead. Marshal Crawford might still be in town." "Actually," a voice came from the back of the church, "I think we can help with that." Evelyn turned to see Margaret Patterson from the general store in Stillwater, accompanied by a large man who must be her husband. Margaret was smiling broadly. "What are you doing here?" Evelyn asked, bewildered. "Tom Crawford sent us a telegram yesterday saying you 2 would be in Laramie for the trial. We came to support you, but the hotel clerk said you'd already left for the church." She moved down the aisle with purpose. "And before you protest, yes, we'll gladly serve as witnesses. Someone needs to make sure Luke Bennett doesn't mess this up." "I'm not going to mess it up," Luke protested, but he was grinning. "That's what they all say." Margaret's husband extended his hand. "James Patterson, pleased to finally meet the woman who's got our friend Luke acting like a human being again instead of a hermit. The ceremony was simple and brief, exactly what Evelyn would have chosen if she'd had time to plan. Reverend Patterson spoke about commitment and partnership, about choosing to love someone every day, even when it wasn't easy. He talked about building a life together on a foundation of trust and respect, about weathering storms as a team rather than individuals. When it came time for vows, Luke's voice was steady and sure. I, Luke Thomas Bennett, take you, Evelyn Rose Carter, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to stand by you in good times and bad, to build a home with you, to honor you, protect you, and love you for all the days of my life. Evelyn's voice shook slightly, but she meant every word. I, Evelyn Rose Carter, take you, Luke Thomas Bennett, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to stand by you, to trust you, to build our future together, and to love you for all the days of my life. The Reverend smiled. By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Luke, you may kiss your bride. And he did, sweetly and thoroughly, while Margaret wiped away tears and James clapped Luke on the back and the Reverend chuckled at their obvious affection. When they finally broke apart, Evelyn was officially Mrs. Luke Bennett, and the reality of it hit her with stunning force. She was married to a good man, a man she loved and who loved her in return. After everything that had happened, after all the darkness and fear and desperation, she'd somehow stumbled into something genuine and real and worth having. You all right? Luke asked quietly, seeing the tears gathering in her eyes. More than all right. I'm happy. She laughed through the tears. I don't think I've ever been able to say that before and mean it completely. They signed the marriage register with Margaret and James as witnesses, and the Reverend gave them a copy of the certificate. Margaret insisted on taking them to breakfast at a nearby restaurant to celebrate, and they spent an hour eating and talking and beginning to process the enormousness of what they'd just done. So what's next? James asked as they finished their meal. Back to the ranch? Back home, Luke corrected, his hand finding Evelyn's under the table. We've got a lot of work to do before winter sets in properly, and I imagine people in Stillwater will have questions about the sudden marriage. Let them question, Margaret said firmly. Anyone with eyes can see you two belong together. The rest is just gossip. She turned to Evelyn. But you should know, Clara Morrison and her friends are going to have a field day with this. Married less than 6 weeks after arriving in town to a man who wasn't even the one you came for. They'll say all sorts of uncharitable things. Let them say what they want, Evelyn replied, surprised by her own certainty. I know the truth. Luke knows the truth. That's all that matters. That's the spirit? Margaret raised her coffee cup. To Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, may your life together be long and happy. They left Laramie mid-morning with well wishes from Margaret and James ringing in their ears. The ride back felt different somehow, lighter, more hopeful. Evelyn rode behind Luke as before, but now her arms around his waist felt less like necessity and more like privilege. This was her husband. This solid, steady man who'd saved her from a night of despair was now permanently, legally, completely hers. What are you thinking about? Luke asked after they'd been riding for an hour. About how strange life is. 2 months ago I was scrubbing other people's laundry and dreaming about escape. Now I'm married to a rancher and heading home to a canyon in Wyoming. If someone had told me this was how things would turn out, I'd have thought they were mad. Are you having regrets? Not even a little bit. Just marveling at how quickly everything can change, how one moment can pivot your entire life in a new direction. That night at the station was the pivot point for both of us. Everything before led to it, everything after flows from it. Evelyn thought about that, about Samuel Reed's letter and the train ride and the endless hours of waiting. I should probably write him a thank you note. Reed? You're joking. Half joking. If he'd shown up, if he'd actually married me, I'd be stuck in some miserable arrangement with a con artist. Instead, his absence led me to you. In a twisted way, his worst qualities gave me the best thing that's ever happened to me. Luke was quiet for a moment. I prefer to think it wasn't about Reed at all. You were always going to end up exactly where you needed to be. He was just an obstacle on the path, not the path itself. That's a much more romantic way of looking at it. I'm a romantic at heart. Haven't you figured that out yet? They stopped for lunch beside a small creek, letting the horse rest and drink. Luke spread out a blanket and they ate the food Margaret had insisted on packing for them. Bread and cheese and apples, simple but satisfying. The autumn sun was warm despite the underlying chill in the air, and Evelyn found herself completely content in a way she'd never experienced before. "Tell me about your first winter at the ranch," she said, lying back on the blanket and watching clouds drift across the impossibly blue sky. "What should I expect?" Luke stretched out beside her, propped on one elbow. "It's isolating, beautiful but harsh. The snow comes heavy and stays for months. We'll be snowed in for weeks at a time, just us and the animals. Some people go crazy from the isolation, but I always found it peaceful. A chance to slow down, to focus on simple things." "It sounds lonely." "It was, but it won't be anymore." He traced a finger along her jaw. "Now I'll have someone to talk to besides the horses. Someone to read with and plan with and argue with when cabin fever sets in." "You think we'll argue?" "I think two people living in close quarters through a Wyoming winter would have to be saints not to get on each other's nerves occasionally. But that's normal. That's real. We'll argue and make up and figure out how to navigate each other's rough edges." Evelyn turned her head to look at him. "I don't know how to be married, Luke. I never saw a good example of it. My parents barely tolerated each other from what I remember. The couples at the orphanage were mostly miserable. I don't have a template for this." "Neither do I, really. Anna and I never made it this far, so I guess we'll have to figure it out together, make our own template." He smiled. "We'll probably make mistakes. I'll forget to listen when you're trying to tell me something important. You'll get frustrated with my stubborn streak. But as long as we keep choosing each other, keep working through the problems instead of running from them, we'll be all right." "That simple?" "That complicated. But worth it." He leaned down to kiss her, gentle and unhurried. "We've got time, Evelyn. No need to figure everything out today." They arrived back at the canyon as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western ridge. The cabin looked exactly as they'd left it, but somehow different too. More substantial, more permanent. This was home now, truly home, and Evelyn felt a surge of possessive affection for the rough log structure and the little root cellar room and the chickens scratching in the yard. Luke helped her down from the horse, but instead of releasing her immediately, he swept her up into his arms. "What are you doing?" she asked, laughing. "Carrying you over the threshold. It's tradition. We don't have a threshold, we have a doorway and a step." "Then I'll carry you over those?" He did exactly that, maneuvering through the door with surprising grace given his burden. Once inside, he set her down gently. "Welcome home, Mrs. Bennett." The name still felt foreign, but Evelyn liked the sound of it. Mrs. Bennett, wife, partner, words that carried weight and meaning and the promise of permanence. "It feels different now. The cabin, I mean, like it's really ours instead of just yours with me visiting." "That's because it is ours. Everything I have is yours now too. For better or worse, we're in this together." They spent the evening settling back in, and Evelyn found herself noticing small things she'd overlooked before. The way Luke had carved their initials into one of the porch posts at some point during her absence. The addition of hooks by the door clearly meant for her coat and shawl. A new bookshelf he must have built specifically for her growing collection of books. "When did you do all this?" she asked, running her hand over the smooth wood of the shelf. "While you were testifying. Needed something to do with my hands, and I couldn't stand just sitting in that courtroom listening to them dissect your life." He looked almost embarrassed. "Figured whether you said yes or no to marrying me, you'd still need a place for your books. You built me furniture while I was facing down Samuel Reed in court. I built you furniture because I love you, and I wanted you to have nice things." He crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. "And because making something with my hands is how I process difficult emotions. I was terrified you'd fall apart on that stand, or that the jury wouldn't believe you, or that somehow Reed would weasel out of justice. Building things kept me from going crazy with worry." Evelyn pressed her face against his chest, breathing in the scent of him, leather and horses and pine. "I love you too. I don't think I've said that out loud yet, but I do. I love you, Luke Bennett. I know. You married me. That's a pretty clear indication. Still, you should hear it. I love you. I choose you. Every day for as long as we have, I'm choosing you." He tilted her face up and kissed her with an intensity that made her knees weak. This wasn't the gentle, tentative kisses they'd shared before. This was the kiss of a husband claiming his wife, of two people finally free to express everything they'd been holding back. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "We should probably talk about sleeping arrangements." "Should we?" Evelyn's heart was racing. "You're my wife now. You don't need to sleep in the root cellar anymore. But I don't want to assume, don't want to push. I want to be with you." The words came out firm, certain. "No more separate rooms, no more careful distance. We're married. I want to be your wife in every sense of the word." Something heated and possessive flashed in Luke's eyes. "Are you sure? We can wait if you need time." "I'm sure. I've never been more sure of anything." He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Evelyn felt herself responding with an enthusiasm that would have shocked her younger self. This was right. This was real. This was everything she'd been too afraid to want finally becoming hers. Luke pulled back slightly, his breathing uneven. "Then let's do this properly. Let me carry you to bed like a proper husband on his wedding night." "It's not even dark yet." "I don't care." He swept her up again, carrying her toward the bed in the corner, the bed that had been his alone but would now be theirs. "We're newlyweds. We're allowed to be scandalous." Evelyn laughed against his neck. "I don't think anyone's watching to be scandalized. The chickens might be judgmental. The chickens can mind their own business." He set her down on the bed gently, and for a moment they just looked at each other, the weight of what they were about to do settling over them. This would change things, make their marriage real in a way even the ceremony hadn't. There would be no going back after this, no easy dissolution if things went wrong. But Evelyn didn't want easy. She wanted real. She wanted Luke, and the vulnerability in his eyes told her he felt exactly the same way. "I've never done this before," she admitted quietly. "I don't know what I'm doing." "Neither have I, not really. Anna and we were waiting until after the wedding, and then she died before—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "Point is, we'll figure it out together. And if it's awkward or strange at first, that's all right. We have our whole lives to get it right." "Our whole lives?" Evelyn reached up to cup his face. "I like the sound of that." What followed was tender and awkward and utterly perfect in its imperfection. They fumbled with unfamiliar buttons and laughed at their own clumsiness and discovered each other with the wonder of people experiencing something profound for the first time. Luke was gentle and patient, and Evelyn found herself trusting him completely, letting go of fear and self-consciousness in favor of simple connection. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed that was now theirs, the last light of day fading into dusk beyond the windows. Evelyn felt different somehow, not fundamentally changed, but more herself than she'd ever been, as if some final piece had clicked into place. "Are you all right?" Luke asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "I'm wonderful. Why wouldn't I be?" "Some women find the first time difficult or painful or disappointing. I just wanted to make sure." "It was perfect." She turned to face him. "You were perfect. We were perfect together." He smiled, boyish and pleased. "I'm glad. I was terrified I'd mess it up somehow." "You didn't mess anything up. You made me feel safe and loved and chosen. That's all I needed." She paused. "Do you think Anna would mind? About us? About this?" Luke considered the question seriously. "I think Anna would be happy I found someone to love again. She wasn't the jealous type. She believed love was infinite, that caring for someone new didn't diminish what you'd felt for someone else. It just expanded your capacity to love." He tucked a strand of hair behind Evelyn's ear. "But this isn't about Anna anymore. This is about us, about building our own life together. She'll always be part of my history, but you're my present and my future. I don't want you to forget her. I don't want to be some kind of replacement. You're not a replacement. You're something entirely new. I loved Anna for who she was, sweet and gentle and optimistic even when things were hard. I love you for different reasons, your strength, your determination, the way you refuse to let life break you even when it tries. You're both precious to me, just in different ways." Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you for saying that, for meaning it. Always. He pulled her closer. Now we should probably sleep. Tomorrow we need to deal with real life, chores and animals and preparing for winter. But tonight, let's just be. They fell asleep as the stars emerged, wrapped in each other's arms and the quilt Anna had made. And if Evelyn dreamed that night, they were good dreams of spring planting and summer warmth and futures that stretched bright and infinite before her. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Word of their marriage spread quickly through Stillwater, and the responses were mixed. Margaret Patterson threw them a small celebration at the general store, inviting the few families who'd befriended Luke over the years. Clara Morrison and her circle spread vicious gossip about the unseemly haste of the wedding, but even that felt less wounding than it might have once. Evelyn had learned that people who chose cruelty over kindness weren't worth her emotional energy. More interesting were the letters that started arriving. Women who'd received Evelyn's warnings about Samuel Reed began writing to thank her, and many asked about opportunities in Wyoming. Was there work available? Were there other good men looking for wives? Could she help them find honest paths to starting over? Evelyn brought the letters to Luke one evening as they sat by the fire. Look at these. Dozens of women asking for help. I want to do something, but I don't know what. Luke read through several, his expression thoughtful. What if we did something about it? Not matching women with men, that's too risky, too much like what Reed was doing. But what if we helped women come west to find real work, helped them get established with legitimate employment? How would that work? Well, you know firsthand how hard it is to find decent work as a single woman, but there's always demand for teachers, seamstresses, cooks, housekeepers. What if we served as a kind of employment service? Women write to us, tell us their skills, and we help connect them with actual jobs in the territory. We'd verify everything, make sure the positions are legitimate, maybe even have them stay here temporarily while they find their footing. Evelyn felt excitement building. That could actually work. But we'd need capital to help with travel expenses for women who can't afford it, and somewhere for them to stay while they're looking for positions. We could expand the root cellar into proper guest quarters, maybe build a small addition to the cabin. As for capital, he paused. I got some money from the marshal, restitution from Reed's seized assets. Not much, but enough to get started. And I imagine some of the women Reed stole from would be willing to contribute to a fund that helps other women avoid the same fate. You'd really do this? Take on that much responsibility? We'd do it together, and yes, I would. I think it's important work. He took her hand. Besides, you've got a gift for this, Evelyn. You see people clearly, understand what they need. That's valuable. They spent the next several evenings planning, sketching out ideas and systems and safeguards to ensure they'd actually be helping women instead of exploiting them. Margaret Patterson got involved, offering to help vet potential employers. Marshal Crawford agreed to run background checks on anyone looking to hire through their service. Even the minister who'd married them offered to provide temporary housing for women of good character while they transitioned. By the time the first snow fell, they had a plan. Evelyn sent out letters to the women who'd contacted her, explaining their new employment service. The response was overwhelming, dozens of women eager for legitimate opportunities, willing to take the risk of heading west if it meant honest work and fair treatment. The first woman arrived in early December, a widow named Catherine with 2 young children. She'd been a teacher before her husband's death, but lost her position when the school board decided a woman with children couldn't properly manage a classroom. Evelyn helped her find a position at a small school 2 towns over, provided temporary housing, and made sure she and her children had warm clothes and enough supplies to get through the winter. Watching Catherine leave with tears of gratitude in her eyes, Evelyn felt something shift inside her. This was what she was meant to do. Not just survive, not just build a life for herself, but help other women do the same. She'd been given an unexpected second chance, and now she was paying it forward. "You're glowing," Luke observed that night as they prepared for bed. "I feel useful, important, like I'm making a real difference." "You are. You're changing lives." He pulled her into his arms. "I'm proud of you. I couldn't do any of this without you." "Sure you could. You're strong enough to do anything you set your mind to, but I'm glad you don't have to do it alone." Winter settled in properly after that, Snow piling deep and winds howling through the canyon. They were snowed in for weeks at a time, just as Luke had predicted, but Evelyn found she didn't mind. The isolation that might have felt oppressive before felt cozy now. They read together by the fire, played chess, and argued about strategy, planned expansions to the ranch and the employment service. Luke taught her to track and hunt small game. She taught him to cook properly, and they laughed at his early disasters. On particularly cold nights, they'd lie in bed and talk for hours, sharing stories from their pasts, dreams for their futures, fears they'd never voiced to anyone else. Luke told her about the war, about things he'd seen and done that still haunted him. Evelyn talked about the orphanage, about feeling invisible and unwanted, about learning to hide her emotions because showing them only made things worse. "You don't have to hide anymore," Luke said one night after she'd shared a particularly painful memory. "Not with me. Whatever you're feeling, whatever you need, you can show me. I'm not going anywhere." "How can you be so sure? People always leave eventually." "Because I choose to stay. Every single day I wake up and choose you, and I'll keep choosing you until the day I die." He kissed her forehead. "You're stuck with me, Evelyn Bennett, for better or worse, remember?" "I remember, and I choose you too, every day, no matter what." They celebrated their first Christmas together quietly, just the two of them, and a modest tree Luke cut from the forest. Evelyn made a special meal, and Luke surprised her with a set of books he'd ordered from a catalog months ago, poetry and novels she'd mentioned wanting to read. She gave him a new shirt she'd sewn in secret, working on it late at night while he slept, and the look of surprised pleasure on his face made all the stolen sleep worthwhile. "I'm not used to receiving gifts," he admitted, running his hands over the careful stitching. "This is beautiful, Evelyn. You deserve beautiful things. You deserve someone who takes care of you the way you take care of everyone else. I have that. I have you." January brought a blizzard that lasted 3 days, trapping them completely inside. On the second day, cabin fever started to set in, and they had their first real argument, something stupid about how to organize the bookshelf that escalated into raised voices and hurt feelings. Evelyn retreated to the far corner of the cabin, wrapped in a blanket and refusing to speak. Luke worked on repairs with more force than necessary, the bang of his hammer punctuating the awkward silence. Finally, as darkness fell, Luke crossed the room and sat beside her. "I'm sorry, you were right about the books. I was being stubborn for no good reason." "I'm sorry too. I shouldn't have implied you were deliberately trying to make things difficult. Cabin fever makes people crazy. We're going to argue sometimes. That's normal." "Is it? I don't know what normal looks like in a marriage. I think normal looks like this, fighting sometimes, making up, not letting the sun go down on anger, learning each other's triggers and trying to avoid them, but accepting that we'll push buttons anyway because we're human." He took her hand. "As long as we keep talking, keep choosing each other, even when we're frustrated, we'll be okay. Promise?" "Promise." He pulled her into his arms. "I love you even when you're being stubborn about book organization. And I love you even when you're being deliberately obtuse about simple solutions." They made up properly that night, and Evelyn learned that reconciliation could be its own kind of intimacy. The vulnerability of admitting fault, the relief of being forgiven, the reconnection after distance. It was all part of the complicated dance of building a life together. By the time spring finally arrived, breaking winter's grip with muddy ground and dripping icicles, Evelyn felt fundamentally changed. She'd gone into winter as a new bride, uncertain and still learning how to be married. She emerged as a wife, a partner, someone who knew how to navigate conflict and compromise and commitment. The process hadn't been easy, but it had been worthwhile. More women had been writing, asking about their employment service, and Evelyn spent the early spring days organizing a system for processing applications and vetting opportunities. Luke started construction on an addition to the cabin, a small wing with 2 bedrooms that could house temporary guests. Margaret Patterson became a full partner in the venture, helping interview prospective employers and providing housing in town for women waiting for placements. By April, they'd successfully placed 8 women in legitimate positions across the territory. By May, that number had doubled. And by June, when the first anniversary of Evelyn's arrival in Wyoming approached, they were fielding inquiries from women as far away as New York and Georgia. "We're going to need more space," Luke said one evening, surveying the growing stack of letters, and maybe another person to help manage everything. I was thinking the same thing. What about hiring someone from the women we've already placed? Someone who understands the mission and has been through it herself. That's brilliant. Do you have anyone in mind? Catherine, the teacher we helped in December. She's established now, but she mentioned in her last letter that she'd like to give back somehow. She'd be perfect. They wrote to Catherine, who eagerly accepted. By July, she'd moved back to Stillwater and was working with them full-time, helping coordinate placements and mentoring new arrivals. The employment service, they'd started calling it New Horizons, was becoming something bigger than any of them had imagined. As the first anniversary of that night at the train station approached, Evelyn found herself reflecting on everything that had changed. A year ago, she'd been desperate, alone, holding a letter from a man who'd never existed. Now she was married, purposeful, helping dozens of women find legitimate paths to better lives. The contrast was almost dizzying. "What are you thinking about?" Luke asked, finding her on the porch one evening as the sun set over the canyon. "About how different everything is now. About how one terrible night led to all this good. Are you happy?" Deliriously, impossibly. Sometimes I'm afraid I'll wake up and find this was all a dream. Not a dream, just life finally treating you the way you deserve to be treated all along. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You know what tomorrow is?" June 14th, a year since I arrived in Stillwater. A year since the best thing that ever happened to me rode in on the train from Philadelphia. He turned her to face him. "I was thinking we should celebrate. Take the day off from work, go into town, maybe have dinner at the hotel." "That sounds lovely, but there's something else I want to do first." "What's that?" Evelyn took a deep breath. She'd been keeping a secret for the past few weeks, waiting for the right moment to share it. "I want to go back to the train station, stand on that platform where you found me, because I think I need to properly say goodbye to the woman I was that night, and thank her for being brave enough to wait for something better." Luke studied her face. "That's a beautiful idea. We'll do that first thing tomorrow morning." They arrived at the station just after dawn, the sun painting the sky in shades of pink and gold just as it had a year ago. The platform was empty except for them, and Evelyn stood in the exact spot where she'd waited through that endless night, remembering the fear and despair and crushing disappointment. "She was so scared," Evelyn said softly. "That woman who sat here alone. She thought her life was over, that she'd made a terrible mistake she could never undo. But she kept going anyway. Didn't give up even when she had every reason to. Because of you. Because a cowboy rode through the dawn and offered her something she'd never had before. Genuine kindness with no strings attached." Evelyn turned to Luke, taking both his hands. "I want to tell you something I've never said properly. Thank you. For stopping that morning, for offering help, for seeing me when I felt invisible, for everything that came after. You saved my life in more ways than one. You saved mine too. I was barely alive when you arrived, just going through motions. You reminded me what it meant to actually live." He pulled her close. "We saved each other, and we're going to keep saving each other every day for the rest of our lives." They stood together as the sun climbed higher, and Evelyn felt the last shadow of that terrible night finally lift. She'd come to this platform as Evelyn Carter, desperate and alone. She was leaving as Evelyn Bennett, loved and purposeful and home. As they walked back to their horse, Evelyn looked back once at the empty platform. "Goodbye," she whispered to the ghost of her former self. "Thank you for being brave enough to wait. Thank you for being open to possibility, even when everything seemed impossible. Look what you gave us." Luke helped her onto the horse, then swung up behind her. "Ready to go home?" "More than ready." They rode back through the canyon as morning light turned everything golden, and Evelyn thought about all the women they were helping, all the lives being changed, all the desperate situations being transformed into new beginnings. She thought about the letters that kept arriving, each one a story of struggle and hope, each one an opportunity to make a real difference. But mostly she thought about the man riding with her, this cowboy who'd appeared through the dawn and taught her what it meant to be chosen, to be valued, to be loved. Their story had started with abandonment and betrayal, but it had bloomed into something beautiful and lasting and real. Some people might say she'd been foolish to answer Samuel Reed's letter, to travel across the country on the word of a stranger, to risk everything on a promise that turned out to be a lie. But Evelyn knew better. Sometimes the path to where you're meant to be leads through dark places. Sometimes you have to get lost to find your way home. Sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as disasters. She'd been abandoned at a train station, left alone with nothing but broken dreams and $50. But she'd also been found there by a man who saw her worth when she couldn't see it herself. And that made all the difference. As they approached the cabin, their home, Evelyn smiled. The abandoned mail-order bride had waited all night at a lonely platform. And when dawn finally came, so did a cowboy who changed everything. Not by offering her the life she'd thought she wanted, but by helping her build something even better. A life of purpose, a life of partnership, a life of love earned and given freely with no lies or schemes or false promises. Just two people choosing each other every day, through every season, for all the years to come. And that, Evelyn thought as Luke helped her down and pulled her into his arms for a kiss that still made her heart race after a year of marriage. That was the